Blazblue doesn't make any sense. Despite stylistically missing the E, you're required to toss aside your understanding of the English language and simply accept that pronunciation is Blazblue. It's the strongest ringing endorsement to the stupendous success of a series of 4 fighting games can immediately filter out anyone who hasn't played any of them by how they pronounce the title of the franchise. That might seem impressive if you're paying attention to what I'm saying, provided you aren't one of the many who are still in disbelief at the runtime of this video. For any newcomers, I typically indulge in the comfortable video length of over 20 minutes, less than 40, which makes my departure from that format something I must address immediately. As lengthy and wordy as this entire project ends up being, I feel that every minute is necessary, critical, to explain my understanding, interpretations, analysis, and opinions about this gargantuan franchise that has become an exponentially more favored and colossal pillar in my life. I have spent countless hours per week playing the games, reading wikis, listening to its music, reading its additional adaptations in the form of novels and manga, watching and reading developer interviews, and contacting people in the community for second opinions. My earlier drafts of the script were not able to account for the lengths I would go to and how long I would end up speaking on specific subjects relating to the franchise, which is reflected in how long it took to craft the very first part of what will end up becoming a video series, retrospective and analysis, made up of 4 different videos. Number 1 being what you're watching right at this moment. Not you. You don't count. I plan, at least for the moment I am writing this script, to have a dedicated video for each main installment of the franchise. This video will be for Calamity Trigger, the next for Continuum Shift, the one after that, Chronophantasma, then finish with Central Fiction. I'm unsure if supplementary material like manga and the anime adaptation will have their own dedicated sections in other projects or be mentioned as part of a mandatory cursory glance for comparison. So consider the full review of games like X-Blaze, Crossblaze? I don't know, up in the air until further notice. I also can't promise any release dates for those future 3 videos. This one video took quite a bit of time, and the other 3 will only end up longer and more thorough. I understand my lack of 100% concrete planning and structure might sometimes become troublesome down the line, so I understand some confusion from my audience. I must refute that and say there is no higher form of flattery than imitation, and I have been inspired by Blazblue's experimental and impulsive nature by going with the flow and doing what feels right in the moment, as much as I can while balancing proper formatting and the pacing I've elected to follow, ideally. The structure of all 4 videos shall go as follows. Each topic has its own dedicated section/chapter listed in the description below with an allotted timestamp to indicate when they begin and end. Some topics are obviously linked together through what I mentioned from previous segments, but I have intentionally crafted this video not to discourage anyone from jumping from whatever topics they please whenever they want. Just don't be upset when you don't understand certain segments, because you've likely skipped over some information I've provided. If you aren't interested in hearing me explain something like development history or the basic mechanics of the game, your experience won't be too mucked. I do ask that people in the comments section be careful with talking about story events or details featured in later games. These games are fairly old and their stories have been told, but I am specifically judging Calamity Trigger on its own merits, so please don't be confused when I don't mention something that was explained later on. I will repeat some points from other segments to help color my arguments, but I don't advertise that as a problem given the length of the video. You will certainly forget at least one of the times I mentioned something because of the segmentation of the chapters. The game's modes are the primary feature of discussion, but other topics such as a brief history of the game's development and a breakdown of the game's characters and story after I've engaged with their respective mobs will be present, then punctuated by a conclusion after everything is addressed adequately. The main goal present with this video is a retrospective from my own perspective and experience, but my aim is twofold. I want someone who has never played this game or series to walk away with at least a half-decent understanding of the game, and hopefully a desire to play it afterwards. Or at least play Central Fiction. No one plays the other ones online. This series of videos will appease people who are only interested in specific segments, and those who opt to start from the very beginning and reach the conclusion while you play this in the background while playing Minecraft or falling asleep. Of course, there will be complementary visuals to make this a satisfying and entertaining piece to watch, but still caters to people who prefer an auditory experience. I should take this time to mention during the introduction that I am not an expert or even a seasoned fighting game player. please understand that my closest equivalent is Mortal Kombat, which is not a very apt comparison given their wildly different mechanics. For a lot of terminology and discussions of game balance and matchups I don't offhandedly know, I am consulting two primary sources. The Dustloop Wiki, which acts as a hub for just about all information you could want for BlazBlue's Punisher, Arc System Works games, and some friends on Discord who are more knowledgeable in the culture and topics than I. I highly recommend you make as much fun of me as you want for being a noob, both because commenting boosts my video's performance in the hell on earth that is the YouTube algorithm, and I always welcome critique and insight. I felt the need to disclose that info at the start to warn that this is perspective of a relative newcomer to the genre. I typically detest asking for the typical content creator platitudes right at the start of a video. If you've seen my other videos, which you should turn into by the way, you'll know that. But given the extraordinary length of this script, editing, footage recording, and project in its entirety, I feel I am at least a little justified in asking, if you like this or similar content from me, you are more than welcome to subscribe and share the video to anyone you feel would enjoy it. As much as I would like to shill Patreon, I am not relevant enough to have an account yet. This is also my endorsement. This video is not sponsored, so don't expect any obnoxious abrupt cutoffs to talk about a subpar razor. I do ask that you understand that I am only human and simply cannot speak about every single small detail this game has to offer. I'm confident that I can cover the essentials and everything I really had to say something about, but there will likely be small details I've overlooked, either by choice of omission or I simply forgot to mention something really funny. It wouldn't be spectacularly entertaining to cover every single bit of dialogue or comb over frame data, so just look on Dustloop and the wiki if you want that. I have a limited amount of time to put into the scripting, recording, and editing of this project, so I ask that you understand. If not for me and the sake of my health, then the sake of my hands and ass, which have been in jeopardy during the creation of this titanic project. They're quite sore, as you can imagine. One last thing, for the sake of the review, I will primarily be talking about and showcasing footage from the Steam release of Calamity Trigger, as well as contrasting it with the Xbox 360 release of the same game. All footage you see will be of Calamity Trigger will come from the PC version, because my religion does not allow console capture cards. So just listen closely when I have to talk about the 360 version. There is a significant reason why I've chosen the topics that I have. That will be explained later. Without further delay, allow me to take you on a journey through the Azure and talk extensively about Blazblue Calamity Trigger, henceforth referred to as CT for simplicity. In the begotten times of the late 2000s, the fighting game genre was in an interesting place. Coinciding with the rapid increase in technology at the time, many fighters chose to become three-dimensional and stick that way. See franchises like Mortal Kombat. 2D fighters were still very much a thing, especially with titles like Street Fighter, but they made the jump to 2.5D, typically involving three-dimensionally modeled characters fighting on a two-dimensional plane. I'm hardly alone in saying that a lot of 3D models tend to show their age quickly, if not immediately at launch, which wasn't the issue for sprite-based fighters, most relevant to this topic, Guilty Gear. Published by Arc System Works, the creator of just about half of the relevant fighting games in the last decade, and developed by their quote, Red Team, Guilty Gear was their flagship franchise, until it wasn't. This series' development and history is worthy of its own separate coverage, but for now, understand that Guilty Gear got in some hot water when the company that sort of owned it, Sammy, merged with Sega. The whole situation is confusing and not very well documented in English, as I understand it. So, Arc System were technically allowed to make another game, but it couldn't include a lot of the content from newer installments, which would have had disastrous consequences for the ongoing story. Well, they did make an alternative, but alternative is perhaps too kind of a word for Overture.
Godfather, Grand Theft Auto. This ain't even out yet. This over in Japan, read the back hood. See that? That's them Japanese signals. Yeah, I know how we do it, but like that.
Instead, Arc System got together a team, henceforth called Team Blue, of returning and new developers to create a new franchise entirely, spearheaded by company regular Mori Toshimichi. If it helps, imagine Mori as a sort of Tetsuya Nomura figure in the company, previously designing characters until he got the green light for producing his own games. Blazblue vaguely existed as a series of concepts for a JRPG, as reports claim, so the complicated story and off-the-wall character designs were very much kept intact during the game's shift for genres. Mori would serve as a director, producer, concept and system designer, illustrator, scenario writer. Just about every role in the team Mori had a part in fulfilling for the original arcade release, which would then turn into home console ports a year later. Much of the story and several of the character designs were inspired from Mori's childhood, one of the characters even coming from his middle school ideas. By now, Guilty Gear's mechanics had become very complicated, so they began designing Blazblue with a more newcomer-friendly mentality, which is darkly comical considering how astronomically poorly of a job CT does with that, which I will comment more on later. Given how much similar DNA the two franchises share with each other, it's no surprise that several characters resemble each other, sometimes in design or mechanics. CT was released in arcades in the year 2008 in Japan, and then home console versions on Xbox 360 and PS3 a year later. Exact sales numbers are difficult to come by, but an old GameFAQs thread I found from 13 years ago claimed that it sold at least 65,000 units in the first month, which is surprising. At least until Guilty Gear was put to bed, Blazblue was here to stay. Several other games and expansions would come our way to the west after the Japanese arcades. The description for the Steam page even reads, "the first high-res 2D fighter from the creators of Guilty Gear," so the segue was only natural. Anyone who has played the Steam release of CT will know that it was released at the startlingly late date of 2014, just a year before Central Fiction, or CF, the final game in the franchise, was released in arcades. But you don't often see the Steam version come into conversation. This can be for several reasons. Most obviously, CT's time in the sun had long since been relinquished. Much like a vampire, CT's popularity as a multiplayer experience crumbled once Continuum Shift and its expanded versions came onto the scene, acting as colossal improvements over its sister game. The second reason why is a little bit more curious. The Steam port is bad, like horrendously bad. It's a kind of terrible thing that raises the eyebrow, both in horror and confusion. Like, how did you mess this up? Legitimately, how? It has been some time since I've last programmed anything, but what had to go wrong in the IDE for this semi-aborted port to come to light? Being semi-connected to Sega will just do that, I guess. The complicated narrative of Blazblue is so meta and all-encompassing that it even affects the release schedule of its games. CT had an original PC port in 2010 for Windows Live, which held the dreaded Games for Windows Live's attachment issue. For the Steam port, they decided to strip the online capabilities and remove Games for Windows Live, an effect they had questionable success in. While I agree that the networking was not something they should have taken the lion's share of time implementing, given that it had already died by the time the game's sequel had come out, I don't think the team responsible for the port knew how deep they were digging, because there is an astronomical amount of issues with this release, some of which are present before even installing the game. CT is a whopping 12 gigabytes, which is 2/3 of Continuum Shift and Chronophantasma's enhanced versions combined. A cursory glance at Steam forums revealed that there are dozens of duplicated files and folders that can be safely deleted to achieve the intended file size of around 6.5 gigabytes. There are several other bugs that prevent the game from even launching. Those are a little bit less fun to fix. When you can launch it, make sure to plug your ears because the animated opening is not subject to the in-game volume options and will blow out your eardrums without manually messing with your computer's sound. The sound in general is an issue with this port. Cutscenes are often out of sync with the dialogue and visuals. Story mode has a very prominent bug where background music simply does not play during most events.
Please.
Do you have any idea what that guy's done? If you do, then you...
I know that.
Jeez, how many of you got involved with the Boundary?
It might seem like nitpicks that I'm selecting from a hat, but with more and more of these bugs at a time do serious damage to the immersion of the game, which affects the overall playing experience. especially since the home console release nearly a decade prior have none of these issues. If you do want to play CT, I would recommend finding it for home consoles, or the PSP port a few years later. If you can tolerate Android phone graphics, that is. This is all within just booting up the game, mind you, and there are dozens of critical issues. But perhaps none more so troublesome than this one right here. There's an option to enable the FPS counter of the game, and look how unstable it is. I can't understate how critical, how objectively, ostensibly important it is for fighting games to not be struggling to run 30 frames per second. Without stable performance, how can you even ensure your button inputs are properly registered? How can you face an opponent if the game can't correctly keep up with all the movements happening? Your expectation ability to improve learning specific characters has been extremely kneecapped, no, crippled by the inconsistent ability to pull off the most basic string of combos and moves. Running at 30 frames mean the game is only checking inputs at half the speed as intended, which makes pulling off those inputs feel demonstrably luck-based and highly inconsistent, which makes progression for learning each character's playstyle and inputs a complete joke, and not a particularly funny one. Everyone who has played this game seriously against another player has not used the Steam version, instead typically played the PS3 version, or literally anything else if they want to avoid the headache of having to pray the game functions without stopping everything for tech support. The Steam port isn't the only option, but it is the most available option because the older console ports are not being supported. The Xbox and PS3 versions don't seem to be available when I looked on their online marketplaces, and my PS3 is somewhere in storage, so I really can't verify. I'm not digging that thing out. Hope you like finding discs on eBay. There are still so many mechanics that need explaining that simply cannot be pulled off reliably under the constraints of this version. So, for all future footage and references, keep in mind that it isn't my general lack of skill that always acts as a barrier for understanding, but that the game sometimes doesn't register button inputs. That's what I tell myself, at least. Providing all buttons aren't working as intended, that is. In my experience, buttons will sometimes just stop working, which requires restarting the game entirely. I failed to capture it, but I was practicing with Jin, the B button just unbound itself and would not function until I reset the game. Many users are unable to fix the frame rate past 31, which is disastrous. I seriously don't know how this error occurred or why this port was still deemed acceptable enough to be put on the store page. How is one to fix the inconsistent frame rate? For me, it sort of seemed to fix itself temporarily when I booted up the game again and then went back to 30 frames later, until I reset my computer altogether. The inconsistent nature of the frames is represented by me always keeping the counter on, to show how flexible it becomes without constantly reminding people of it. Just look in the upper left-hand corner to see why my footage is somehow choppy. This is all through just booting up the game. I haven't even been able to mention the mechanics the game has to offer without offensively terrible bugs and poor performance wrecking the entire experience. No other PC port of a Blazblue game offers this poor of an experience because they weren't ported from a shoddy PC versions from forever ago. I'm unsure of the performance of that original PC version, but my gut telling me gutting games for Windows Live certainly didn't help. For comparison, Central Fiction, or CF, is running at a perfect 60 frames, despite coming out several years later and being the most demanding game, and not being incredibly well optimized either. Continuum Shift Extend, another late PC port of an older game released in the same year, is also at a stable 60. Oh yeah, no achievements either. Hope you're not one of those guys who like Steam achievements, because there are none. I even booted up a couple Guilty Gear games to see how they perform, and none of the issues are present. Street Fighter 4 doesn't even have this issue. I apologize for speaking about this issue for so long, but it's important that I create an understanding of where the fighting game scene was during CT's release, which was released during a major drought of popular fighting games. CT, and mostly Street Fighter 4, were responsible for a huge resurgence in the genre. This tidbit will not be relevant until years later when I release a Central Fiction video. But remember Blazblue's release schedule with Street Fighters. I promise it will come up again in a couple years. Don't worry about it. Even with some of the more questionable and downright diabolical mechanics, Blazblue's place in history for the genre and, by extension, video games, is something I tremendously respect. and it's such a damn shame to see it so poorly represented by a lackluster PC port when it should be celebrated like its peers. It's devastating. I should probably start speaking about the actual gameplay now. For this segment, I will be combining my explanations and detailing the basic functions of each of the game's 12 playable characters, as well as the fundamentals of controls and inputs, given how comorbid the two topics are. Heading into training mode, we're given a shuriken to select any character we would like. Something curious is that when you enter the selection menu, you have to press the select button to cancel an action, because every other button except start acts as a confirmation button, which is a quirk of fighting games being developed for the arcade cabinets first. The start button activates the character's color menu to choose from 20 different color schemes. Unfortunately, you can't see the wonderful sprites on screen within this menu, so choosing each color palette becomes a game of seeing the 3 primary colors and just hoping it's a good combination when you enter a round. Or a rebel, as the game calls it, enter a rebel. You're able to choose whatever stage you want with whatever music you want, from the OP theme, character themes, etc., no matter how much it fits or clashes, which is a tremendous boon for aiding the game's overall swelling feeling of customization. Choosing a character, their color, setting the music and stage tickles my monkey brain enough to get me fully immersed before even throwing a single punch. Blazblue is often called a 3.5 buttons fighting game, and that isn't for no reason. Each character has 3 primary attacks, light, medium, and heavy. Each of these are represented by a game-specific button on the command list, A, B, and C respectively. Rather than have the controller-specific button representation of moves, this was something I struggled with when I first played the game in 2015, but it rapidly became muscle memory once I stopped trying to associate each of those buttons with the recording button on my Xbox controller, because trying to get your brain to remember that C equals B during intensive gameplay is not going to stick well. Technically, you can bind whatever button you want to different attacks, but I strongly don't recommend doing this, at least on purpose. Clicking the controls menu often leads to misinputs for placing a button because it immediately puts your cursor on an attack button rather than the button to close the menu and not change anything, which is an infuriating design quirk that happened to me so often because the option is directly beneath the command list menu, which you will be pulling up extremely frequently. You can be forgiven for trying the button equivalency strategy first because this game completely lacks any sort of tutorial mode. The manual, which comes digitally with the Steam version, is the closest resource the game has to offer any sort of strategy, and it only consists of how to pull off button commands and guarding. There was bonus DVDs that showed some basic tutorials on the special edition, but are we really gonna take that? Really? Want to buy the special edition just to learn how to play the game? Yeah, no thanks, bud. The method that helped me remember what button does what is to ditch the letters altogether and simply think of it as a shape, a triangle or a square. I'll be using the Xbox controller buttons as a representation, and you can just pretend these are the PlayStation buttons if that is your preferred controller. If you're wondering how it works on keyboard, you're on your own. I know one person who plays CF with a keyboard and he's completely psychotic. You know who you are, you Hakumen-obsessed goddamn nutjob. The keyboard is responsive enough to function, you should really be using a controller, if only to the sake of your hands. And the D-pad. For the love of God, pretend your left analog stick does not exist. But keep the right stick in mind for later. What you need to do is just remember the light attack is the leftmost button, medium is the topmost button, and the heavy attack is the rightmost button. If you remember this triangle, any controller will work after getting used to it because the ABC button is the same layout. You will be able to string all 3 forms of attack together naturally as your thumb becomes accustomed. But what of the downmost? Is downmost a word? Bottommost? What of the downmost button? That is button D, the drive button. The drive button isn't always an attack, but rather a character-specific function intended to combine with every other attack button mentioned or to alter their effects. This mechanic is drastically easier to explain case by case with each character, so I'll save that for later for their segments. Our triangle metaphor has sort of morphed into a square by now with the 4th button introduced, but the key muscle memory is still our guiding key for stringing together combos without feeling lost and confused. This metaphor can apply to every single character in the game, as well as future characters in the franchise. Blazblue is a lot more dependent on understanding individual character structures rather than baseline core mechanics to win fights. But the building block fundamentals are without question the most foundational knowledge one should be equipped with. The trigger buttons on the back can be bound to whatever you'd like, but you'll come to notice the block button, or how there isn't a block button. You simply have to hold back to block an opponent's attack. I highly recommend crouching blocks for all attacks that aren't aerial, then regular blocks because there are multiple points to hit a character, either from standing, crouching, or above. This isn't Smash Bros. Blocking is a huge component of preventing you being trapped in a corner forever. You must take advantage of the momentary slip-ups and block vital attacks to retaliate. We know what pressing down and backwards on the D-pad, but what about forward and up? Forward moves your character, obviously, but double tapping makes them drop bricks and run forward, most of the time. Doing this while you're in the air by pressing up makes you air dash, either to close or greaten the distance between you or your opponent. Blocking is fun and all, but some attacks can't safely be blocked all the time. So what are you to do, other than just hope you can dodge it? This is where Barrier comes into play. Essentially a stronger block, but activated by pressing A-B, which means the leftmost and rightmost buttons. It protects you far more, but at a deadly cost. Every character has a limited amount of Barrier, so you must use it sparingly. Because if you run completely out of Barrier, you can't use it anymore. You enter a pitiful state where you take 1.5 multiplied damage from everything in the game, which can effectively render the battle instantly over in your opponent's favor if your character already has a smaller amount of health, because not all of them are made equally. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Barrier Burst, a last-minute mechanic to completely stop a combo happening against you that throws your opponent off, at the cost of reducing all your barrier for the Rebel, which is shockingly dire. Barrier Burst is a recurring mechanic to the series, but the insane punishment has been drastically softened since CT introduced it. You will come to notice that a lot of brutally punishing mechanics and moves that are fixed or nearly overhauled in future installments. There are other methods for dealing with character guarding too much, however. Simply grab them by pressing BC, which will interrupt their stalling and do some light damage. There are several more mechanics, but none of them can be adequately be explained without first introducing the heat gauge, which is the bars at the bottom of the screen. It's called heat, but in practice the community calls it meter, so I will be referring to it as such. The first of these mechanics that use meter is the distortion drive, which appear at the end of a character's command list, which are usually incredibly powerful attacks or an effect that drastically alters normal attacks. These typically consume about 50% of the meter, but there is a much more powerful special attack called Astral Heat. Drives can be activated if your meter is half full, but Astrals have an insane requirement that bar them from being any more useful than a stylish round finisher than a real competitive edge. Your meter must be 100% full, it must happen when you are one round away from finishing a tourney, and the opponent's health must be below 20%. What does 20% of health look like? Beats me. Values are represented visually, so doing this might not prove super useful consistently. It's overall a much safer bet to remember and use the distortion attacks, which can be activated with much less meter more consistently. If your foe's health is so comically low that a tiny poke could end them instead of remembering a complicated input, which one would you pick? The safer option, naturally. But you do miss out on the incredibly visually stunning attacks and an incredibly satisfying conclusion to a match. Oh yeah, most characters can't even use Astrals until you beat their arcade mode. They don't even appear on the command list menu until then, so you can add that for reasons of why not to use Astral Heats ever. Your meter can also be used defensively. You can use an attack that prevents you from being stuck against a combo, or use a rapid cancel, a mechanic lifted from Guilty Gear, which was called the Roman cancel. Biggest difference is the name. It allows you to cancel an attack that would otherwise lead you to a disadvantageous situation. Do you remember a couple minutes ago when I told you to remember the right stick? Well, hope you did, because the right stick is about to save our entire gameplay experience. A lot of fighting games intended for newer players often include a simplified way to pull off combo strings, usually labeled as some kind of stylish or easy mode, or as critics of Street Fighter VI would call it, the woke controls. CT is no different. The right stick is bound to several combos automatically at launch, which means you can pull off distortions by flicking the right stick to the left. The other games aren't nearly as concerned with these kind of controls, but CF does have a downside of those combos dealing less damage in exchange for being easier to pull off. The manual even calls the right stick Easy Specials. There are ways to achieve similar outcomes with several other games, but I think this mentality of encouraging people to find shortcuts around precise inputs does more damage to someone trying to learn the genre than help or forbid they play another game in the series later. Skipping the ability to learn from manipulating your thumb on the D-pad proves dire to learning how each character functions down to a T, especially facing another player who has intimate knowledge of the game. Some may call it a crutch, some may call it a helpful tool, but it's quite telling that future installments don't encourage this mentality further than CT did, at least as a toggleable option over a baked-in mechanic. There are so many questionable design choices in this game that have been largely dubbed as kusoge, I think it's how you say it, which literally translates to game. CT is far from the only example of this term being applied to a fighting game, but what's important to note is that despite some of its more insane factors, the term is typically used for games that aren't very solid or consistent on a technical level, but are still fun and enjoyable to play nonetheless. This isn't something to be ignored. Even if things are rocky, the core gameplay still feels satisfying to engage with on some level. Unless you play against Arakune or New 13, then you'll wish the game never came out. Even if the networking for player v player is completely dead in the game, it still holds some level of respect as the groundwork for something better to come, which simply wouldn't have been possible without CT being the way it was. How could you know what to improve if you don't receive any feedback? There was obvious playtesting performed, but playtesting doesn't always capture smaller details avid players will be able to catch on to. It's something about the development/work environment that sometimes presents an obstructed view of the bigger picture. Though there are some things I am positively shocked about made it to the final release. None of the combos or mechanics are terribly complicated, in fact they're relatively simple, which is intentional. Blazblue, if proven successful enough during release, could be headed as a franchise, so it was important not to alienate new players by making them learn loads of complicated moves right off the bat. Many players came from Guilty Gear, so it might be understandable why they would choose not to include a tutorial, as not to patronize people who would have been first in line to try the game. Except that's dumb. The tutorial modes have always been optional. If pleasing older fans was the sole focus, then I would say they failed on that basis in a lot of respects, because some characters have so much similar DNA baked into their combos. Ragna is just Soul Bad Guy but worse. Tager is just Potemkin but unplayable. Jin is just Kai if he were Yankee scum. That, combined with the overall simplified system compared to Accent Core Plus, the most recent GG game of the time, might have felt like a step down to a lot of players who dared not sully their hot red bloods with some blue blood. CT was received quite warmly and became fairly acclaimed during release, mostly for its graphics, animation, and story. Wouldn't surprise me to hear that a lot of people experienced with the genre weren't super interested in trying something so obviously made for new people. The two franchises share a friendly rivalry rooted in a love for the genre, filled with banter and pokes, but it wasn't uncommon for many people to feel apprehensive at the start because of the hot water GG was settled in during release, which is morbidly ironic now considering Strive has made waves as the biggest fighting game with the most amount of secondaries, and Blazblue is... Oh right, I've almost forgot to mention. Training Mode's input system is actually insane. All of your previous inputs are kept on the bottom of the screen. It was intended to practice, but it just becomes completely unintelligible because inputs you performed several moves ago are still on screen. You need to keep your eyes on the bottom right to know exactly what inputs you have performed and follow it as it scrolls to the left. I don't know about anyone else, but this is nearly impossible to keep up with. Why are basic movement inputs given just as much focus as me trying to press quarter or half circles to get my specials out? I think it's ridiculous and doesn't encourage people to go just beyond memorizing the command list to learn their preferred character. CF has a live representation of your D-pad gate in exact inputs right in the middle of the screen, so your attention isn't nearly as divided as it would be otherwise. This keeps your head in the fight and allows your brain to make the proper associations with button combinations and muscle memory for each character. And speaking of character, I should probably mention them. Let me go one by one. It's been like 25 minutes, I've yet to mention how a single character plays. Leave a like for that one, lads. Our main protagonist, he's on the box art, all the marketing, that's right. Soul Bad Guy. Sorry. Dante. No, Ichigo. Okay, Titus? Okay, look, Ragna isn't exactly subtle. From his absurdly sized blade, spiky white hair, and Kevin Smith pants, this guy screams edgy protagonist, which gives you a pretty good idea of how he plays without knowing any of his moves. He's got the punches, kicks, sweeping slashes, culminating a bare bones but effective mix-up close-range fighter, benefit of the rush-down cloth he and Soul are cut from. But there's more to him than meets the eye. He isn't quite the generic protagonist you might think he is when you sneak glimpses of his personality, and the same applies for his gameplay. Where Ragna differs is his drive. All of his drive attacks are slow but hugely powerful slashes that drain the opponent's health to restore some of his own, which partially makes up for his smaller health pool. Combined with gaining meter extremely quickly, Ragna can sap a large amount of health and execute powerful attacks that deal considerable damage. This is exacerbated by Bloodcane, his dragon install form that slowly drains his health but powers up all his drive attacks, which gain him more health. If that all sounds a little basic, it's because it is. Ragna, being the guy in the box art, is about as simple as they come for Blazblue terms, which is hardly a bad thing. You need to start somewhere, and there is no better choice than Silver Titus. Where Ragna really struggles is range. He's all close range and doesn't have an effective way to deal with being zoned out by projectiles aside from Carnage Scissors, which sucks so bad you don't even want to use it. Really unfortunate he is contrasted with New 13, the game's resident zoner, an infinitely better character in battle. I didn't actually start with Ragna when I first played. I chose Arakune, which is really dark considering how demonstrably cracked he is in comparison. The funniest thing about Ragna is that most of his neutrals are kinda ass, except his B attack. Those Kevin Smith pants are legitimately more of a threat than his drives, purely because of how wide an arc he casts. Maybe I was wrong the whole time, the pants really are more deadly than the amount of Seether he can control. Overall, he's just an okay character in the grand scheme of fights because he has decent neutral and ways to close the gap, but struggles when he isn't close enough to people to breathe down their necks, which all of the best people in the game are able to smack you from afar, which throws quite a wrench. Speaking of range, another beginner character, but with one major difference. He's good. More than that, he's got range. Jin's attacks focus on keeping your foe exactly where you want them, with a range of ways to close or widen the distance with lightning fast speed. His drive involves freezing people in ice a la Sub-Zero in Mortal Kombat, where the ice comes into play isn't just for more powerful attacks, but to interrupt people in the middle of their combos, which allows you to set up on them at a moment's notice. You can catch people lunging at you and stop them dead in their tracks with a drive attack from close range or mid-range. It isn't so much that ice defines him in the context of a fight as his ability to put you where he wants you, and following up with a series of lengthy attacks, or to keep you stuck in the ice cycle. So many of his attacks are comfortable close up or at a distance, which makes him viable on either front and able to deal with people who specialize in range or close quarters. He doesn't deal quite as much damage as his edgier brother, but he makes up for that with the fact he has much more finesse and room to counterplay people. Jin is one of the few characters that can be explained pretty concisely because he does something not a lot of other choices can say. He works properly and has ways to not get instantly flatlined when taken out of his comfort zone. A lot of these overviews kind of tend to be me explaining the weird quirk each character has, but Jin is fortunate enough not to need that. Dustloop says it best, Jin is just plain good. I struggled to write anything down because it took me a lot of practice to understand what Noelle was all about, but I think I got it. Despite her gun show, Noelle is pretty adept at getting in your face and rushing you down, but how she does it is entirely centered around combos and chaining. Her attacks are close up and can be very quickly merged together by using her drive, which allows for a variety of different moves to come out very quickly and easily ensnare your foe inside for successive hits. Chain Revolver leads into one of 4 different moves that can all end with a special move, with one huge catch: she can't do it in the same move twice in a row. This might seem limiting and it can be very much exploited, but this is the genius of it all. You can very rapidly lean into an attack that catches your foe off guard. There's only so much preparation someone can do when bracing for several different kinds of attacks at once. Going drive is a big warning to your foe, but how that warning turns into an active threat is up to you. Noelle tends to throw people back with a lot of her attacks, which combos beautifully into her distortion attacks, which can be inactivated in midair or standing. I have to apologize for my less than stellar gameplay here. She was probably my least favorite to play preference-wise. You're gonna have to take my word on a lot of the more advanced tech she's capable of, more than skilled players can achieve. So what makes her that much more of an effective rushdown compared to Ragna? She's honestly just more competent with what she can do and quickly perform than he can. Despite having such an embarrassing neutral ability, she doesn't entirely need to use it to be effective. Mix-up just comes so naturally to her that, combined with her surprising ability to zone you out with some projectiles, and sometimes just delete projectiles because of Kusoge programming, and being quick on her feet, she's a delight for skilled players who like to keep people on their toes. If you had to give someone just one example of how unique and interesting the drive mechanic can be, I point to no better candidate than Rachel Alucard. Her drive is not an attack, it's the wind. By pressing D in a direction, Rachel can blow a gust of wind to carry her in whichever direction you'd like. That sounds like something only useful as an escape tool, but where this drive really shines is how it intersects with the rest of her set. Many of her inputs put out the same effect, but with different ranges. She has this one move where she launches a projectile that turns into a lightning rod. This is the setup. The payoff is when a different input can electrocute the rod, and you can launch it at 3 at a time. See where I'm going with this? You can use the wind to directly push people onto the rods to achieve maximum damage, but that's only the start. You can blow your people into yourself and hit them with surprising amount of high damage neutrals with interesting range. She has a tremendous number of ways to defend herself at a range and instantly change the flow of battle how she pleases, but as you would have guessed, this requires quite a bit of setup. She's hardly defenseless without her rods and electric frogs, but many of her strongest qualities come from clever timing and setup. Otherwise, she's vulnerable to being rushed down and folded like laundry. Such is the punishment for someone with spectacular zoning capabilities. The drive mechanic is so fantastic because of this reason. Hers is not an attack, it's entirely support that can intersect with such creative input. And creativity is the name of the game with her. Her animations for attacking are completely absurd in the most pleasing way possible. What makes her easily one of the best characters in the game is that her setup isn't complicated mechanically, but requires a lot of knowledge of the opponent's moveset and how to directly avoid or exploit it, to begin throwing random Halloween objects and being the architect of their downfall. There's a fairly substantial barrier to entry with this character, but not one that requires you to trade your soul for. Those characters will come later. With a resoundingly solid moveset and insane potential, it's no secret why Rachel is such a powerful pick and easily within the top 5 of this game. Honestly, the only reason why she isn't any higher is because the very best of this game are legitimately broken from a mechanical standpoint that makes fighting against them sometimes literally impossible. I'm going to be transparent, I straight up don't know how to describe Taukaka. I mean, I do, but not in the gameplay sense. When I started using her, I was beyond confused when I tried to find info on Dustloop. This was the only info I could find, so I was a bit of a loss. I have experimented with her somewhat in CF, and she's fairly comparable in both games, so the same characteristics can apply. Tao is described as a hit-and-run character, and I really think that fits. Her agility is absurd. It's completely insane. She can triple jump, for crying out loud. She shreds people up close with her massive claws and has a couple projectiles in the form of rotten apple cores. But what she specializes in, or specializes in quotations mind you, is being an absolute headache to deal with. By design, she darts all over the place with her drive, which is a pretty basic pouncing attack, but be warned, this kitty has claws. Given her mobility, the pounce will combo into basically anything given someone can keep up with her demanding agility by putting in the exact inputs to fling people around like ragdolls and abuse her obnoxiously funny mix-up ability of hitting people high and low at a moment's notice. The problem with Tao is just trying to do all that and not get hit, because it's really easy to get hit. A lot of Tao's attacks do some dummy damage, but they slow hell, which leaves you pretty open to getting your grill rearranged. For someone not taken very seriously, there's a surprising amount of handiwork required to hit the same high as a lot of characters who can do more naturally. Does this mean there isn't a reason to play Tao compared to others? Well, I can't say for the context of other games, but she still cracks a pretty good punch in CT. Her mobility allows her to bypass a lot of the more frustrating zoning moments in the game and avoid being clobbered by characters like Tager, implying Tager is capable of doing such a thing though. She might surprise you with what you can get away with given the right hands, but you enter a unique dilemma. Either a Tau player is an insane force of nature that must be reckoned with, or a Coomer. Yeah, probably a Coomer. There are probably better options than Tau, but you do get one benefit of playing Tau. Tau herself.
Meow! It hurt! Meow! What did you just do to me?
That's my line. You're a run from the Kaka clan, ain't ya? You got some nerve sneaking up behind me to steal my food.
Oh, my strategy played out perfectly. What a sneaky man. You should be ashamed of yourself. You're not gonna get away from this. Meow!
Better than being Carl, at least. Carl might be the strangest character in the whole game. Hell, maybe even the franchise. But for CT, there are some things you must understand. Carl is what called a puppet character, someone whose inputs control two different characters. Those playstyles wildly range between games, but for Carl, this means his drive all relates to the big robot lady doll he lugs around. His attacks don't deal a lot of damage, and he focuses a lot on positioning. He has a sort of shadow step to fling himself around to get into doll position. His drive involves her slowly clunking to the opponent and dealing shockingly slow attacks that don't deal much damage. His most powerful inputs involve using her big gorilla arms to manhandle people, at least on paper. In practice, you probably aren't getting caught with how slow she stumbles around the place. Even more fun, you had better get out of her way as Carl, because if you stand in front of her, you can completely muck up your distortions, which are more of their big gorilla arms slapping around. At least you can get her to teleport back to you if you get too desynced. Be careful not to spend too much of the meter, or else she goes inactive and you're really in hot water waiting for her to be used again. So this shouldn't be rocket science. He's a defensive character with very little ways to deal substantial damage very quickly, and more vulnerable than available to attack. It's not shocking to find out that Carl was not just bottom 3, but considered in the worst character in the entire game. That is, Carl is pretty light, which means he has some mobility. So what if you were able to combo your foe into the air with basically anything at all? Remember to position the doll. Simply jump up and air grab them, then have the doll perform the 8D move, which you press by pressing drive plus up, and congratulations, you have just won your round. All the footage you'll be seeing of this is from other people, because if I play this character anymore, I'm going to drown myself in the Ottawa River. For some reason, for some godforsaken reason, this single clap move is completely unblockable in the air, even against barrier. The mechanic intended to block just about everything. The enemy can do literally nothing as you continuously grab them in the air and clap them up. This is called the clap loop, and because of this exploit, Carl's actually top tier. Literally nothing else matters in his kit. Whatever method used to grab your opponent in the air works, and you will instantly win, as long as you aren't playing against a skilled Rachel or any form of Arakune ever. Without this exploit, Carl is the worst character in the game. Actually getting to pull it off isn't insanely difficult, but it is pretty damn stale for a one-trick pony. And I'm not playing arcade mode like that. I'm not doing it. I refuse. I'm just grabbing clips online for everything I need. I am not engaging with this dookie-ass character. If it's any solace, Carl gets some retribution by being a monster in a lot of future games. He is horrifying to fight against in CF. Past this point, I must issue a warning. I think there's 2 more normal characters. Normal as in not insane from a design standpoint, in a way that makes them broken to fight against or play as, but there are so many that are. Let's get the regular ones out of the way. Provided you aren't too distracted by her immaculate sprites. By that I mean her entrance. Holy moly, that flip looks cool. You will find that Lychee is a very strong pick suitable for a variety of situations who isn't too hard to pick up at first and flourishes in fights when you get the hang of her. Her central gimmick is being able to switch between 2 different playstyles. With her staff, her attacks are slower but have a lot of range. Dropping or throwing the staff with her drive shortens your range, but you become dramatically faster with nearly all of your attacks. It wouldn't be totally inaccurate to say that you would need to learn about 1.5 of a character, because so many of your attacks change properties with or without the staff. The main advantage of this is being unpredictable. Flinging your staff or using it as a mobility tool at a moment's notice to apply a huge amount of unpredictable pressure on someone. Just as your foe might be getting used to your increasing speed, you can fling back to deal some chip damage, and you can keep them at a distance and deal devastating attacks from a new range. Her specials and distortions are no different, usually targeting people from a safe distance, which you can come closer by using her staff. The unpredictability and ability to switch on a dime makes her a fantastically powerful combatant, but not without huge drawbacks. The main one being a barrier to entry. Her inputs and ability to change stances comes from a lot of practice that other characters don't always require. Not having intimate knowledge of how she plays pretty soundly leads to having your ass kicked on the regular. Positioning is something you must be keeping track of. You have to make sure you can be in the most optimal locations for your shifting your moveset, and making sure your most powerful moves will deal maximum damage. It's something added with the staff, but might seem so strange to think of your setup and have to execute around that, on top of defending yourself while doing so. She's different enough to feel distinct for such a familiar playstyle as a stance. Even basic executions and attacks still feel fun and exciting. She's definitely one of the more involved characters that requires a lot of skill sharpening to use effectively, but it certainly is rewarding. My gameplay and explanations do not entirely do her justice. I highly recommend you check out with experience someone playing her. I ran into a very funny issue with Bang on CT. His Dust Loop page just says unplayed character and Bang does not function. If you've ever faced him in arcade or story mode, you might be inclined to agree, because the CPU has absolutely no idea how to play Bang. But there is some interesting tech you can do with him. I'll try my best to explain. Bang is another rushdown character with great agility. What makes him so different is the plethora of unique mechanics he has to work with. Near his drive bar are 4 icons. This is where he shines. All of his drive's attacks are slow, but act as counterattacks that can combo with different inputs. Your drives all spell out Fu Rin Kazan, but to explain that, I need to explain nails. Nails are the numbered objects that Bang has. He can place them in the air or ground, and they accelerate him extremely quickly in a specific direction. He has to place them quite carefully to position himself in the way to deal damage, and then quickly out of the way. Fu Rin Kazan is a super state that allows Bang to have nail tier dashing whenever he wants. It's such a dangerous skill that you have to earn it with skillful attacks to use it. No other character in the game operates like he does, and to achieve his most optimal playstyle, it's incredibly unique how interestingly his drive intersects with limited nail resources. You have a lot of management on your plate when you're focused on attacking, using nails, and getting all the kanji filled out. Aside from his little area denial nail attack, he's a close quarters fighter that takes time to set up, but when you do, it is curtains for your foe. Is what would have been said if anyone actually played this character. It's not so much that Bang is a bad character, but his demands are simply too costly to compete against characters who don't need nearly as much. What he can achieve is very impressive, but only the highest scale of that is actually poignant. Actually getting there and getting it bogged out because you have to spend a lot of time trying to counter opponents and dance around them. So those were the normal characters. Past this point, we were about to cover characters who are so baffling from a gameplay perspective, so insanely programmed, that you might need to get a drink to get past this point. Are you prepared? I hope you're sitting somewhere comfortably. Alright, let's get the most insane choice out of the way. You know how I often give characters a basic archetype description like Rushdown, Zoner, etc.? You know what Arcune is? No idea. I don't know. Trying to describe it in words doesn't do any zany animations justice. Arcune is supposed to be a slow fighter focusing on close range, I think. What he ends up being is having just about every base covered with a plethora of insanely good moves. He can go invisible, just because. He has plenty of aerial cover damage due to how slow his air dashing is and covers a lot of screen real estate. He can straight up go underground and completely bypass any moves. Blocking. Who needs to block when you can go under and over basically anyone in the game? Trying to hit Arcune is incredibly difficult, but he can hit you pretty easily with a huge swath of far-reaching and high-damaging moves. But what's his drive? That would be Curse. Curse places a sort of status effect on the opponent and makes bugs flock to them once you release any of the other attack buttons. These bugs deal damage and tend to interrupt people when they just try and play the game. How does one activate Curse? Any drive moves. Literally any of them. I'm pretty sure blocking activates it sometimes too. Unsure if that's a bug or a feature. If that hasn't set in, let me explain further. Being cursed means bugs can fly from anywhere and attack you wherever Aracune wants. And all he has to do is use any of his drive attacks to apply it. This ability was absolutely crushing to play around for years. Imagine trying to play the game as literally anyone and instantly getting cursed and you have your health drained in an instant. It's not even just curse. His normal moves are considered powerful too. Putting both of those together, he just shreds your health and you've got nothing left to give. All the other best characters in the game have pretty small health pools too by comparison. Unless you're using someone like Hakumen, which, no you aren't, you're gonna get grinded instantly. Surely Aracune has a weakness, right? Like he's really slow or has no health or some obvious drawback to his awesome power? No, not really. Some of his ground movement is sluggish, but he doesn't need it. His aerial abilities are so absurd that you can just be as comfortable in the air on the ground playing anyone else. The only real drawback that prevents him from being an insta-win character is that a lot of his buttons and more abusive tactics require some timing and skill. You can probably win by button mashing, but skilled players have long since suffered the days of playing against this monster, so counter strategies to take him down have been in circulation for almost a decade. Not that anyone still learns strategies to play through that game. His name still ushers in terrible memories to seasoned players. Oh yeah, fun fact, when I selected this character again for the first time in almost 10 years, a storm had started brewing outside and hail began pelting my window. This lines up with Dustloop listing one of his downsides as Faustian Bargain. You don't even need to use distortions. They're really good aerial damage, but damn, you don't need all that when he's as strong in the air as he is. Pro tip, if you and a friend are playing this game, and if he chooses Aracune, you need better choices of friends. If you were using Aracune, your friends need better choices of friends. Choosing him is an implicit "I hate you" statement to anyone in the room. There are precious more details to explain, but I think CT Aracune could genuinely be his own video, so I'm gonna move on to the next combatant. On the topic of busted characters who can get their own videos, here's New 13. Oh, okay, she already has. New is the zoniest zoner to ever zone. Normally, zoner characters don't tend to be at the very top of a leaderboard, either because they weren't designed to be that powerful, or something not intended by the developers, like a move not functioning correctly. With her, I'm really not sure if they playtested. New's drive allows her to shoot out rows and singular swords basically wherever she wants, with insane damage. They're insanely fast, cover basically any angle possible, and can essentially be spammed with no real punishment for doing so. Normally a zoner is really good far away, but terrible up front, which was clearly the intended purpose. But no, she can switch from her insane swords to a shockingly good kit of neutrals and block string abilities that make her an absolute monster in combat. Approaching her in any way is a serious mean for concern, which is just lovely considering her placement in the arcade mode. What about an attack that basically just has you become stuck in place? Gravity Shield is the most insane thing I have ever seen in a fighting game. Need to be in a specific place to avoid her swords? Not with this attack, you can't. Have fun burning through barrier. It's completely bonkers how free all of her attacks are. Sure, she has paper-thin defenses, but actually getting to her is a total pipe dream. With Aracune, there is at least some intimate knowledge of the game to have him flex to his fullest extent. Would you like to know how New can perform best? Just memorize the combos in your set. The bare minimum basics of remembering what buttons to input is what almost guarantees you to win. As if she wasn't already busted enough, her meter gain is insane. Your specials can come out basically whenever you feel like it, dealing with attacks overhead, underneath you, and anywhere she pleases while she farms a meter all the way across the screen is insane to fight against. Oh yeah, her grabs are on the level of Hakumen, which means they also do obscene damage. You basically don't even need distortions to win, because they do slightly more damage than regular attack stringing can do, if not less, to how pathetically easy it is to spam her swords. You might be noticing a pattern with a lot of the strongest characters. the aerial advantages. Fights take wing, and usually the character with the great aerial grabs or mobility or damage reigns supreme. It's no surprise that Arakune, Rachel, and Nu are without questions the best characters in the game, while ones with mediocres or sometimes basically no ability to fight while jumping are sweeping the bin at the bottom tier. Nu wasn't part of the original arcade release, or at least she wasn't on the traditional select menu without a code. From the angle, I sort of get why she would be so strong. She is the last fight in almost every arcade ladder, so I suppose she's intended to be a busted character. I have some theories that poke holes in that statement when I move on to the arcade mode segment, but hold on for that for now. One last thing about Nu is that she was never this strong again. Blue Team knew what they concocted something diabolical when they designed her moveset, because one of her only 2 cons listed on Dustloop is talking about how crummy she is in CF. I don't even think she was super great in Chronophantasma either. So we've talked about the regular characters, the one regular humans being picked to have fun. Some range from good to mediocre to terrible, but most of them, they function mechanically. Except for Carl, whose only reason to be good is a borderline exploit. We've now finished talking about the very best characters in the game who have flourished from questionable game design. But questionable game design is a two-way street. You can just as easily have a character who is totally quashed by that design to the point they become unusable. Lucky for us, we have 2 prime examples of that. Let's start with the second saddest character in CT. You might be surprised to see me describe Hakumen as terrible, given how much insane damage he deals in the arcade mode, but believe me when I say, you have been misled. You are fighting a superpowered version of Hakumen that isn't comparable to his actual in-game stats. His shocking damage comes from a huge, monumental flaw. Everything else in his kit is terrible. Horrific, even. He has the second worst mobility in the entire game, which leads him to take a lot of damage literally anyone else can avoid. His backdash basically has no invincibility and is so slow and so not capable of dodging anything, which leaves you so wide open. I need to quote Dustloop for this. Possibly the worst backdash in all of BlazBlue. 0 invincibility frames, oh my word. You've definitely noticed how weird his meter is. Hakumen operates on a Magatama system, which means his heat gauge is split differently to everyone else and acts as a resource he needs to tap into to perform special moves. This concept has worked for other characters, but for Hakumen, this is his absolute death seal. How do you earn Magatama? Just wait. It's a passive regen. That sounds interesting, having to wait to perform any supers, and you're stuck with your normals, which actually do quite a bit of damage, but they take ages to land. Each special costs Magatama, which means you can very easily get trapped in performing basic specials and resetting the counter back to 0. Fortunately, his drive allows him to gain Magatama as well. What is this drive? It's blocking. Not just blocking, this drive allows for a block to counter system that deals the decent damage and earns more resources. But this block is without question the worst block in the entire game. It is so damn hard to time with an opponent's attacks, because pressing backwards and using barrier feels a lot more natural and can actually block attacks. Using Hakumen's drive is just leaving yourself wide open because you have to time it perfectly to counter anything at all. Mind you, this block has been fine in other games, but for the specific matchups you'll find in CT, it's not going to help unless you're fighting Tager. God forbid anyone chooses Tager. When he's able to open a full Magatama slot, his distortions are very powerful, but still underperform. Flicking the right stick left leaves a huge slash that can take 1/3 of your foe's health, but all they have to do is block it, which is piss easy to do. His entire playstyle revolves around waiting. You need to wait to use Magatamas, need to wait until you can use your surprisingly decent neutral moves, and wait until you can release an insanely predictable and easily avoidable super. The funny part is that basically none of it works, except for his neutrals, but still best used as retaliation instead of being an active aggressor. Not like he can catch up to anyone to try and be an aggressive, mind you. You only really have one playstyle. Wait and do chip damage until you can unlock more moves. It would be a real shame if these unlocked moves were also bad. Well, would you look at that. Just about all of them are extremely awkward and sluggish, except the dash, that was pretty good. Not even worth talking about his special state. Actually getting to this point is straight up not worth it or even possible at times. It's such a shame. He has a pretty solid kit on paper, but just about none of it works in practice. It's really embarrassing how the only way to win against someone who knows how to block and counterattack is to basically beg. Also, he cancels into just about nothing, which is hilariously grim. But he isn't the worst character in the game. Would you believe me if I told you there was someone even worse? Ladies and gentlemen, I give you. Hey guys, I'm not doing this video anymore. Playing Iron Tiger makes me want to die and stop the video, so I decided to take a break and go outside. Here's some photos of me outside remembering the sun exists. Hope you can understand. Okay, no, he's just one character. I can do this. You know how important mobility is? Even slow characters need a chance to recoup and not get comboed into oblivion and get a chance to attack or defend. Tiger cannot do this. Tiger cannot run, cannot dash, has one jump. I am being completely serious. Can he defend himself at least? No! This big lug is so huge and so wide that he takes stray damage just by being chosen as a character. Look, I think we can all assume he was the grappler of the roster. Grapplers are usually pretty large and can afford to take some damage to get people closer to execute big damage attacks. Tiger? All of his attacks are so damn slow and clumsy that you might be able to reach your foe if they put their controller down and take a bathroom break. He basically has Slow Start, Regigigas' ability from Pokemon, on all times, with no way to turn it off. No matter how much he tries and fails to pull people in, he will get completely stomped on up close because he barely reacts to taking damage. Imagine that, a grappler that pulls you faster to lose. And speaking of pulling you closer, let's talk about this drive. Voltic Barrier harnesses the power of magnetism to force people to be magnetized close to you. This is horrible for every single reason I've listed. If you can even land a drive attack, they are the slowest parts of his arsenal, which means you can't even take advantage of his awful drive. And if you can, you lose faster because he sucks. His combos? What combos? He can't. Tiger is literally too slow to achieve a combo in most circumstances. He has no anti-airs, no worthwhile neutrals, abominable frame data, and has the worst matchups against every other cast member. Maybe except Hakumen. Maybe. I am being completely serious when I say this is not exaggerated. Do you want to see his only pro listed on Blazblue? Can still win. Is the only positive listed. And even then, the win condition becomes within grasp when you're fighting against low-level AI players or a decomposing corpse. And I still might be betting on the corpse to win if you whiff too many sledgehammers. Every mad or strange mechanic goes against Tiger. He benefits from literally nothing in the game. No amount of invincibility frames or defenses or blocking will make this character usable, worthwhile, fun, or interesting. It is ludicrous to imagine how this character exists and was deemed A-okay to be put in as is. It's mind-boggling. Now do you understand why I decided to not do this and go outside? So, that's about every character in CT covered. You have definitely noticed how many of them are strange. There are plenty of weird and puzzling mechanics put into the game, where some characters benefit tremendously from and some don't. I hope you're able to remember all these when you play your favorites, and remember how to counterplay everyone else, or at least the most commonly picked characters. CT's smaller cast has the advantage of not having to cram every hit and hurt box of everyone immediately. 12 characters is a pretty good starting size for a game released in the late 2000s, but when you start setting stipulations on the roster, you will see how much less variety is. Suppose you were playing with a friend on the couch and the both of you agreed to not picking a character who is absurdly overpowered or underpowered, either through questionable game design or exploits. There is a difference in that, and just strong characters in the latter typically have balanced movesets and defined playstyles that don't rely on said Kusoge mechanics. This means Arcune, Nu, Hakumen, Tager aren't being selected, and maybe Carl if you can't come to an agreement on Claploop. This would leave you with Ragna, Jin, Noelle, Taukaka, Lychee, Bang, and Rachel as your cast, which means if you want close range choices, you have to choose Ragna, Noelle, or Tau. If you want more range, then Lychee and Rachel. Somewhere in the middle, Jin and Bang. Carl sucks so much acid, if you outlawed Claploop, you might as well not even pick him anyways. A lot of the more usable characters feel very similar to each other, and there isn't a lot of variety. Of course, this is just a hypothetical situation, and most tournaments, even casually, don't abide by that. But it does present a troubling precedent that Team Blue had a tough time balancing and creating the more unique characters in the game. Of course, there is more details to explain about everything. For the interest of time, I have elected not to do so. Both because I am simply not capable of learning an entire roster's detailed ins and outs very quickly, and because you don't have to either. The draw of a fighting game roster is to choose someone who jumps at you, either through the specific playstyle, character design, music theme, etc. Universal mechanics are obviously important to understand, but each character's individuality is much more highlighted mechanically. It's part of what differentiates the series from other fighting games. People usually find their main character choices because of a meme or particular move. What character do I main? No one in CT, that's for sure. Not exactly a huge swath of choices, even less so when choosing one that won't give me funny looks from other people. That's what I have to say about each character. Keep in mind, I didn't get a huge amount of practice against other players because the online's dead and no one sane wants to go all the way back to the first game in the franchise. Historically, most famous fighting game franchises don't start amazing until the second iteration. It's hard to declare something a classic if it can't be compared to itself. Regardless, that's most of our mechanics covered. Let's take a look at what the game has to offer outside of that. This one doesn't require too much explanation, thankfully. This is one of the core game modes when the game was originally released in Japanese arcades. Dead simple concept. Choose a character, fight in 10 rounds against a different character in each round. The structure is the same. Each round is a random character, with the exceptions of round 4, 8, 9, and 10. 9 and 10 are always fights against Hakumen and New 13 in that order, with the exception of those two characters' routes themselves, likely because the two were not playable in arcades without the use of additional codes. Just win 2 rebels and you win. Thankfully, you don't need to insert a quarter into your computer if you flunk a round. You just start up again on the rounds you lost on. The 4th and 8th encounters are character specific to illustrate a bit of the personalities and story. Arcade mode does have a fair bit of story significance, but typically only comes during the character's endings, once they beat New. Once you beat arcade mode, you typically unlock a character's astral heat, which means that their special, flashy finisher move is not actually available until you beat it, which is an interesting choice. Some characters have their astrals without arcade mode, so I really don't know what they were thinking. It really is just kind of pick and choose. Each character also has something called an unlimited mode. It's just the same character, but all of their stats have been ramped up dramatically. They're faster, do loads more damage, etc. This is typically restricted to local versus mode to mess around with your friends or in training, but you do unlimited versions of characters throughout the story in arcade modes to illustrate how strong a specific character is meant to be, usually in the form of Hakumen or New at the end. Each character has their own ending, and they do infill some of the story blanks, so I'll cover them all. I will also be reading each character's bio from the manual to understand why everyone is in the same location, because if you take one thing away from BlazBlue, it is that a convoluted, insane explanation exists for everything, no matter how absurd or minor, and it will come from places you'll never expect. Let's start with Ragna. Turns out he's a super criminal named the Grim Reaper for how many people he mows down with his sword, called Blood Scythe. Yes, his sword has Scythe in the name, because of his astral. Most of the story takes place in one location, the 13th hierarchical city of Kagetsuchi. What is Ragna doing there? Don't worry, you'll find about it in the story mode. No, you don't. Ragna has some serious beef with these places called cauldrons, and he stops for love nor money to get there. He knocks down everyone in his path until he meets Nu. Nu is usually an emotionless robot, but changes her personality entirely when she encounters Ragna, and really wants to jump his bones. Ragna is reminded of someone while he fights her, which is a shame because Nu impales herself on Ragna, citing something about destiny and falling into the cauldron together. Her specific mention of over and over again implies something pretty interesting about the story, but isn't entirely elaborated on until later. Jin Kisaragi is part of the NOL, or Novus Orbis Librarium, often called the Library. They're basically the world government that built all the cities and control all law enforcement in the remains of the world. Oh, yeah, this game takes place in the post-apocalypse. Don't worry about that for now. Jin is regarded as a serious war hero with a personality as cold as the magical blade he wields. But he disobeys orders and heads into Kagetsuchi to find Ragna. You see, Ragna is his brother, and he won't let him forget that fact.
Why? I thought that was obvious. To see you, brother!
His journey to find Ragna leads him to Nu by coincidence. He was far more interested in the fight with Ragna than fighting her. Rachel interrupts the fight just as Jin talks about remembering some events from the past. We get a flashback to his memories in the form of a cutscene. Jin is training in the NOL Academy and meets a young Noelle Vermilion, who reminds him of someone from his childhood, which greatly frustrates him. You'll notice that most characters confronting Nu doesn't entirely line up. Jin and Ragna's fights take place at different times during both of their respective routes, especially so on everyone else's routes. What gives? Typically, arcade mode isn't considered canonical to the story if the game has a dedicated story mode and exists as a mandatory feature, so people don't freak out. Rather, considering that the arcade ladder is something of an exemplary offshoot timeline for the story. What does that phrase mean, and am I seriously using a phrase as obnoxious as that to describe the most basic fighting game mode? I am. Leave a like for that one. What I mean is that each route can be considered a realistic scenario of what would likely happen if the character were to confront the list of characters that they do in their routes. Character interactions show us great lengths what their relationships are and what the outcome of each fight looks like. For example, Tager and Arakune were friends, or at least alumni at some point, so Tager is fighting him to bring back his employer slash... What? What the... Okay. I wrote something in the script. I'm like looking at it. I guess I didn't proofread this part enough. So I wrote, Tager's fighting him to bring him back to his employer slash mother. Oh dear. I'm so sorry to describe Kokonoha in that way. Oh no. Anyways, the black blobby boy is quite irate and wants to scrap. Arakune escapes under the floor once you win 2 rounds, which lines up with what we know about these 2 characters. And let's be honest, Tao is not making it to the final boss, but the game is at least throwing us a bone on the what-if scenario. Right, let's move on to Noelle next, shall we? Noelle, like it's implied in Jin's ending, is also part of the NOL, but falls under Major Kisaragi's command. She's tasked with visiting the city to retrieve Jin quietly and get him to stop going AWOL. Based on some words spoken to by Jin when she runs into him, she runs into Hakumen and Nu later. Curiously, Noelle claims to remember an exact scenario like this before, where she confronts Nu. She starts to repeat Nu's robot dialogue towards the end. This has 2 major points I'd like to bring up. Her remembering past scenarios lends much credence to what Nu talked about with Ragna, but the potentially cyclical nature of reality, and Noelle's past and possible connections with Nu, who has connections with a figure both in Ragna and Jin seem to remember, which elicit different reactions. Her final cutscene shows her alone in what looks like a hospital bed, until Rachel appears. Something is very strange and strangely afoot with this rabbit girl, and we don't quite understand. Arakune's route is really funny because his only background is a weird gloop person living underground who eats people and Kaka clan members. He literally eats the baby cats of Taukaka people. It's so messed up. Everyone who runs into him is sickened and disgusted, and he can't exactly communicate properly with anyone. He runs into Tager, who Arakune knew before he was a gloop. He gets really upset at Tager's boss, I wrote it correctly, upset at Tager's boss, Kokonoha, and starts getting a whiff of what lies beyond the cauldron everyone's waiting for. Something called the Azure, and Arakune really wants to go inside. His ending is extremely ambiguous. We get a series of voice recordings of an unknown man researching a property known as Seether, which will be a huge recurring topic in the story. His voice begins to resemble the choppiness of Arakune, which implies this researcher is Arakune in the past. But what do we know about this man? We know that he was close to Tager and Lychee, and potentially their boss, Tager's creator, which implies he was a researcher for Sector 7, the counter-NOL branch. Kind of like how the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3 is distinctly their own faction, but fall under the umbrella of something it once was. And on the topic of Sector 7, let's talk about Tager. Tager is an enforcer type of Sector 7 that doesn't question orders. Sector 7 hates the world government the NOL created, which makes him a strange mix of pro and anti-authority. He doesn't care enough to ask why he's headed to find Rogna, just does it. He stumbles from encounter to encounter, being fought against his will and occasionally testing his strength with formidable opponents. Even when encountering new, he just accepts he has to fight and does it anyway. Even if he's horrible to play as, his personality will always be entertaining. His final cutscene has him speak to Lychee sometime in the past, and all but confirms that there's some kind of temporal skullduggery going on in this game, and that Hakumen, yes, the playable Hakumen, was inside a time anomaly that preserved him for decades. He is a member of the group called the Six Heroes, who are credited for saving the world when it was destroyed by a horrible monster. You'll see more Six Heroes talk further into the story. For someone who talks about truth, justice, and love, Bang can be a pretty complicated character. He's a dopey ninja from a country torn apart by war ravaged by the NOL that fights to protect the innocent, but carries a burning desire to restore his peace to his burned country. Trying to find Rogna to bring him in for justice, he runs into Hakumen, or someone he believes to be puppeting his visage for stolen valor, which infuriates every sense of his justice, so they scrap. The only reason he even fights New is because her vibes are off, and he can't stand that. Even his ending is straightforward and to the point. Bang is just looking to protect his people, home, and his ideals, which I think is lovingly simple and compelling. Too bad everyone hates him and wants to take his own life. Everyone is so mean to this guy for no reason. He has this adorable little crush on Lychee that is never reciprocated. It's so over for Bang Cells. Speaking of Lychee, her blurb explains that she's a doctor in somewhere called Orient Town? Oh my. And she's on the hunt for the cauldron for her own reasons. The power inside holds an interesting property for her that isn't entirely explained, even by the ending. She doesn't seem to be on the best terms with her old job from Sector 7, but we don't entirely know what caused them to split. She seemed quite close with Arakune, or whoever Arakune was before he got turned into fried butter. Not a lot of story details to piece together with her latter. Tao Kaka's route is somehow more story-driven than Lychee's. For someone as ostensibly as a joke character as Tao, there's a lot of details revealed during her tenure. Like mentioned, she's a member of the Kaka clan who live underground. Tao is acting as a vigilante to earn money for her clan, but is also hunting Arakune. She briefly fights him and then runs into New 13 because she's bawling. Then we find out that Tao and Lychee are apparently good friends, and that Tao, and by extension her clan, are all descended of one of the members of the Six Heroes. These 6 people who saved the world have their hands in just about all of the characters' business, even semi-joke characters like Tao. Someone want to do an early life check? Carl Clover was early in his life at the NOL Academy until he had to drop out for an unexplained reason. He's trying to find Rogna. Given that Rogna is the most wanted man alive, the bones acquired from turning him in is quite the motivator. Something peculiar about Carl is the doll he's traveling with, who he believes to be his sister. The arcade mode doesn't explain past something bad kind of happened, don't worry about it. Okay, to be honest, I did not play Carl's arcade mode, I just found the ending on YouTube. Go ahead and try playing Carl and tell me it's fun, and then you want to wake up tomorrow and do the exact same thing for footage. You can't. On to the last regular arcade mode, Rachel. She's a strange character because she's intersected with a lot of other characters in a very intimate and kind of transcendent way. She's a vampire living in a far-off castle with her butler who claims to be in the story because she's bored. But we know there are deeper motivations than that. She knows every other character pretty well, even if they don't have any prior history, and clearly has a knowledge of timelines and intersecting moments in history on a level that far outpaces anyone else's. She's totally aware that her fighting New has some kind of drastic effect on the ending of a current timeline. Something like that. Several of the endings finish with some kind of white void or flashing lights that take over the screen. So if we interpret Rachel's words literally, fighting New in the boundary somehow ends or potentially resets it altogether. We see Rachel feeling a sense of guilt over consuming someone's blood, while she's in a white room with the child representation of Noelle, which we know from Jin's flashback and with adult Ragna. Her fate is intertwined deeply with these two, despite how much she would never admit it. Hakumen and Nu have different arcade ladders. The former starts out pretty interesting because of what we know beforehand. He was one of the 6 heroes, but the conflict he was involved with happened decades ago, but he's still around due to some time skullduggery explained in Taker's ending. He finds himself both amused and disappointed with a lot of the other cast as he cuts through them. He's got some serious beef with Nu and is surprised to see her show up so early. After they fight, he runs into Ragna and tells him he's going to put him down the same pit as her. He seems aware of the situation because he knows everyone's going to die, but he's a baller and does it anyway. His final scene sheds some light on the situation the heroes had to deal with. A monster called the Black Beast was wreaking havoc across the entire world. It's a story narrated by Rachel and drawn in the same art style as the most Chosen One prophecies tend to be, which strengthens the sort of fairy tale feeling of the story. Hakumen apparently appeared out of nowhere, and 5 others just joined suit and fought. They were able to beat the beast, but people didn't like that Hakumen criticized them for something. I don't know what it was. And locked him in a dark room like a child having a tantrum. If that dark room is the time anomaly that kept him preserved all this time is left up in the air. Finally, Nu 13's tale is the saddest of all. I've spent so much time talking about Nu, but never really described who she is, because you aren't given a lot right away. Nu is some kind of robot called a Murakumo unit, or android, and that's all we know. She's left as vague as possible because all the story details would completely spoil everything. So I'll leave those details for later. Nu tramples and slaughters everyone in her path without remorse. Then meets Taukaka of all people in Hakumen's place? Yeah, I don't know either. She has to fight Unlimited Rachel at the end, which is teeth-grindingly hard. Rachel remarks that none of these events matter because Nu is dreaming, and Rachel is simply aware of this, despite being in the dream somehow. Winning the fight shows a graphic of someone who resembles Noelle a lot more than Nu, alone in the boundary sleeping. She mumbles out Ragna's name as the endings come to a close. And that's the arcade mode. Once you unlock the cutscenes and unlimited characters, that's all there is to it. Each route doesn't take too long, estimated around 30, maybe 40 minutes depending on if fighting Hakumen and Nu is a pain in the ass or not. Arcade mode gives us brief glimpses into the overarching story mode, which hasn't included in the original arcade releases, naturally. I also think it's a wonderful way to warm up and try and play these characters in a natural experience. There's only so much you can get from the training mode that just has them standing like dummies. Balancing against multiple different characters with different playstyles and learning how to counter and play against them is a lot more useful as a training tool. Now, the story is probably what everyone came to watch this video for anyways, so without further ado, let's damn. You ever notice how pretty this game is? I wasn't entirely able to find a preferable spot to put this segment in, so excuse the intrusion, but goodness does this game look pretty. If you've been watching up to this point, thank you if you have by the way, then you will absolutely have noticed the gorgeous details in the character sprites. Sprites are exceedingly common in video games because it was all that people were able to do and make for several years in the earliest consoles. But now since technology has progressed so far, they've usually been reserved for smaller indie titles when the artist can't draw otherwise. It's a common mentality to leave sprites behind for 3D models once you start making enough money, which is a crying shame because 3D models tend to look strange and uncanny only a couple years after release. Sprites are much more dictated by distinct art styles, so they can stay creative and fresh for a lot longer. Luckily for Arxis, Blazblue's sprites are the stuff of legends. Every character has a distinct pose, idle stance, animation style, and general flair that makes them wholly distinct. The way Ragna's blade hangs loosely from his tent pants compared to Jin's careful handling of his blade screams their personalities more than any other description could. Lavish use of smear frames and color are masterfully included for each special attack that really draw the eyes. According to a series of interviews by Silicon Era, there are 5 important methods to getting the sprites to look as good as they do. First is to draw traditional concept art for a character, which includes all of their animation frames. Every single frame of animation is carefully hand-drawn. Secondly, a 3D model is constructed and posed to match the frames drawn on sketch pages. It's curious to see how 3D models are being handled. The art form isn't solely rejected, but instead used for a construction phase for the sprites to really tie together how many different forms of visual art are used to make the game. Thirdly, the 3D model serves as a base for sprite artists to essentially trace over and reference. This is no small task, despite it being tracing. Every frame of the animation on the 3D model is traced over, and that's where the sprite work is born. Thousands of frames painstakingly redrawn with the consistent art style for each character. I could not imagine how teeth-grinding it was to draw sprites for Arcune. Fourthly, heavy focus is given to the light and shading each sprite, which is done procedurally. And finally, they're ready to be implemented in-game. I really hope they didn't get too many things wrong during the process, because they would have to go back to re-spriting, then start again to insert it and check they got each shade of black right for the shadows. The process is tiresome and long, but produces incredible results. Not every game abandoned sprite work in the late 2000s, but none looked as fluid, as fantastic, as memorable as Blazblue's. They knew they got it right the first time, because for the returning characters, they reuse the exact same sprites, even if that means Carl never gets to grow up. Could you imagine being the guy tasked with animating all of Jin's ice effects? The sprite work is hardly the only art for the game. The other character renders were drawn by Mori himself along with Yuki Kato. The character select screen especially has a lot of time period charm. The way some parts of the body are stylistically oversized is a super charming feature. Look at how squashed Rachel's face looks, it's awesome. It's very much a product of the time art style. The ending cinematics and character sprites are rendered with a lot more detail and eye for proportions, likely a future-proofing effect because they would use the sprites for the entire length of the franchise. The character sprites during the story mode are a little static, and it feels kind of awkward how people just open their mouths and stand there without changing poses. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I wish it were more like Danganronpa, which has the characters at least position themselves more creatively from the waist up to convey a more in-depth and believable conversation taking place, rather than everyone standing still in their stock Family Guy idle pose. Each character has about 20 alternate colors, some of being references to other properties, while other are just alternate palettes. I think most of CT's cast is well designed enough in their own colors, but there are some standouts. Jin looks incredible in basically any color that isn't his default, and Tager looks horrible in every color that isn't his regular skin. Jin already has a lot of clashing colors going on, so something like an all black or all yellow looks really stunning by comparison. Too bad there's no way to tell until you enter a round. Oh yeah, take a notice at everyone's shoes. Everyone wears metal-plated boots, and it will drive you insane every time you look. Character art is hardly the only thing that rounds the experience. Take a look at the backgrounds. I admire how they are so gorgeously detailed, yet completely distinct. The world of BlazBlue is a scrambled mess of different ideas and cultures and themes all stitched together, represented phenomenally well by the boiling culture pot of the 13th hierarchical city. Chinatowns, sewers, grand cathedrals, and lands beyond are brought to life by the steps that the characters' shoes make on the ground and the 3D models we see. That's right, the backgrounds are three-dimensional, but used quite cleverly. The foreground is rendered with a higher poly count not to break immersion, while being spruced with 2D animated elements. Notice the people in the background ignoring a global terrorist killing this dude. The backgrounds of the background, so to speak, are much lower in the poly count, which helps make the game run smoothly. For every version that isn't the Steam port, apparently. It's kind of a wasted effort when the PC version doesn't work well with it, but its clever usage of lighting and mixing low and high poly counts for models intersects excellently to create a compelling environment that feels thrilling to fight in. But something's missing. There's some music that tends to play in the background. You want to know about the music? Most of this video has BlazBlue music in it. Check the description. I don't want to bloat the already extended length of just playing the OST outright, but let me talk about it. Arxis' love for rock and roll is alive and well with CT. Guitars and percussions are married with classical instruments and a huge selection of inspirations. Character themes range from headbanging metal tunes to groovy, swanky tunes to chill to. The composer was Daisuke Ishiwatari, a certified legend in the world of game development. He was the #1 guy making music for Guilty Gear, and he has only sharpened his skills for CT. On a less relevant note, he also made Guilty Gear, like all of it. He did a lot of the artwork, music, project leading on the franchise, and even voiced Soul for quite a while. Arxis has a bit of a reputation for a lot of their flagship series being led under the strong leadership of a single visionary. Daisuke and Mori are close friends, so it's no surprise the two would collaborate for BlazBlue. Hell, Mori even has an OC and accent core with a form of ABA? ABBA? I don't know. Though you would think someone as seasoned in the genre as Daisuke would offer some tips to the development staff, mainly to not end up with characters like Tiger. Daisuke put his blood, sweat, and tears into this album, and it shows. He would go on to be the primary composer of every game in the series, and his wide range of inspirations and sampling give each entry a unique feeling. It's not quite on the level of French bread, mind you, but it's pretty damn close. The music isn't the only bit of audio that rounds the experience. Let's talk about the dub. English dubs for media not created in English-speaking countries have always been a strange case for me. I feel a bit of a dissonance when I watch something foreign because I can't understand the language people are speaking. I know many people are purely subtitle purists and react very harshly to anything contrary. Their stance is not entirely unfounded, however. A lot of the dubbing done for English audiences is done pretty shoddily and not particularly pleasing on the ears. But, beating all the odds, BlazBlue stands head and shoulders above nearly any localized Japanese property. I know that because a lot of the cast comes from the fantastic Bleach dub. ArcSys selected an incredibly dedicated and passionate voice acting crew that went on to define the characters' voices so tremendously that they became the primary voice cast for dozens of players, myself included. Special mention to Patrick Sates, Mela Lee, and Tony Oliver as Ragna, Rachel, and Bang respectively, and especially Philly Sampler's Taukaka.
God, first the rabbit and now you? Why'd all you guys harass me? Get out of my sight. God damn it.
Have you ever heard of the word manners? Inquiring about a lady's nature is not only rude, it is the very height of impropriety.
What a rude little girl. If you keep that up, I'll have to spank you.
Meow! I'm hungry. I'm gonna starve to death. A good guy is just gonna turn a blind eye and let me die? I'll haunt you.
A huge strength of the cast being so dedicated to their roles is consistency. They went on to reprise their roles for all future installments with one exception, and even came back to the limited anime series later, for better or for worse. If one weren't keen on the English cast, mind you, they are more than welcome to change to the Japanese voice cast in the settings. I don't watch a lot of anime and I don't know any of the names in the industry, so I don't have much of a comment to make about the Japanese voices. What I can say is that Ragna is voiced by the same guy who voiced Joseph Joestar, so take that as what you will. Okay, this is probably where most people skip to. BlazBlue's story is extremely complicated, convoluted, and other words that start with C that denote how lengthy and expository it can be. The reason why this video took so long to script and record and to edit is because of this absolutely gargantuan beast of a narrative. It's not so much that the story is extremely long, it's actually fairly concise, but the methods it uses to tell said story is somewhat unorthodox. I'll explain. Each character has their own dedicated story mode section. Each story is told through the lens of a visual novel from the perspective of whomever you've chosen. There are basic decisions you're required to choose to progress the story, but some decisions will lead to game overs, which are compulsory to 100% completion. If that didn't sound daunting enough, losing fights are included in that loss completion, so you need to lose every fight against every character in every route. If that also didn't sound daunting enough, some fights must be finished with distortions, or else you won't be able to progress correctly on the flowchart. Yes, there is a flowchart, but it's only available to see on the PSP version. No other version of the game has any visual indicators of what you're doing and where to go. That is absurdly exhausting and confusing. Why on God's green earth they decided to do this is beyond me. I know the story is non-linear, but they decided to have a narrative follow suit. But that is just insane. I'm not someone who prioritizes 100% completion on games, but for a story mode? Not every ending is relevant to tell the story, but you would be missing out on a character interaction's additional details by ignoring them. Even if the most narrative you'll get is just your character saying, "Damn, how did I lose?" That's just horrific. These sometimes count for 1% of completion too. So you spend more time putting your controller down and letting the AI beat you than mashing through the text than any reasonable player should. I really hope you're comfortable with save scumming, because that is the only way you're going to be seeing every outcome. That's 5 save slots for the entire mode, mind you. Not every character gets their own save slots. Everyone has to share 5. For the love of God, please do 1 character at a time if you plan to fully complete this mode. And to be honest, I'm not doing that. I tried, but having to engage with some of the airtight stipulations you were required to do simply is too much. Doing carnage scissors in this game makes me want to die. I'm not doing distortions all the time. Trying to 100% this mode is about as much fun as putting toothpicks in your toenails and kicking a wall. In order to get all of the multiple endings per character, you need to do so many different routes and decisions and precise actions in battle. What I've done is just start from the beginning and aim for the exact path needed for each ending. There are some routes that require all of the battles to be finished with distortions, and I'm not done doing that. So, when I need to, I'll just be stealing clips from YouTube. Events must be omitted for brevity, but the very small bits of character development are not crucial to understand their motivations or the larger narrative at play. On the bright side, you do not need to do this to achieve the final story section, just complete every character's true ending, I think, and I believe you're good. A very small victory for the sake of my time and hands. Oh yeah, story mode has a bug where no music is played outside the battle.
You don't have an ounce of remorse, do you? All right, here comes an iron fist of...
Wonderful. Before we begin, it turns out the manual comes with its own prologue that I don't believe is entirely explained in-game. Time to flex my vocal muscles. I'll be paraphrasing to not add just straight 10 minutes of reading off pages. Mankind faced extinction from the Black Beast, which rose from the darkness. Man's time was at an end until the 6 heroes used the long-hidden art of magic to slay the beast. The secrets of magic were shared, and man combined it with technology to make Armagus, which seemed to surpass both. This War of the Beast was called the First War of Magic. Once it was slain, it left bombardments of a radioactive energy called Seether all over the world. Armagus regulation was controlled by a new faction that had formed, the NOL mentioned prior, which ushered a new age of development and reconstruction nationwide. The NOL ruled as a mostly peaceful dictatorship globally, despite the largening socioeconomic gap of those who had Armagus and those who didn't. This is where we get the hierarchical cities, which were built on mountaintops to avoid the radiation. Also note that the definitions, I think, change later installments? The system of combining magic and tech is called Ars Magus, while the weapons are called Ars Armagus, I think? Rebels calling themselves the Ikaruga Federation rebelled against the NOL, which prompted Armagus to use against other humans. The Federation was crushed during the Second War of Magic, also called the Ikaruga Civil War, came to an end, which led the NOL to declare that anyone who rebelled again would be instantly killed. We now enter our main story. The dust has settled after the Civil War has been kicked up again by Ragnar the Blood Edge, who is slaughtering NOL armies single-handedly and smashing each city's cauldron, which is their power source. He is heading specifically to Kagetsuchi's because he senses the resurrection of one of the 6 heroes, Terumi. If that sounded wordy and complicated and hard to follow despite being a few paragraphs, because it is. CT, like it handles everything, handles its story very clunkily at the start and expects you to digest a lot of proper nouns and names and locations right off the bat before even starting. I wouldn't recommend having a wiki out because of spoilers, but note-taking is definitely encouraged. Also, I haven't engaged with the game's story mode in almost 10 years, so I'm definitely not remembering everything. I've written a lot of the section of the script as I go, because piecing everything together as you progress is part of the appeal of story mode, rather than a boring, concise, complete timeline overview. I have elected to follow an old IGN guide made for the story mode. It's been preserved on Steam, but following a guide is the quickest and easiest way to consume this mode. I'm not so ready for the journey ahead of me. Like the game mechanics section, I will be dividing it by character for simplicity's sake. After a desynced opening cutscene, we're free to choose almost anyone. I'll put a little notice that tells you which route for each character I'm taking. You can start from any character you'd like, but I believe the layout on the screen is intentional and the simplest way of understanding the narrative, with some limited exceptions. I'll address that later. I'll start with Titus. We see a flashback of Ragnar's childhood when he was an orphan being raised in a Catholic church with his adoptive siblings Saya and Jin by nuns. When he was out to fetch a pail of water, the church was burned to the ground and the nuns were slaughtered. Jin appears to be at least somewhat responsible for the act and delights in the violence by cutting off Ragnar's right arm. An unnamed man is accompanying Jin and taunts Ragnar and lets him bleed out on his own. Ragnar's final thoughts are of Saya. From a broken childhood surrounded by tragedy and combat, it's no surprise that Ragna takes on such a violent and misanthropic persona. He's willing to cut down people mercilessly, but also willing to hear their stories out and take pity on them. Even if he feels insecure by how often he spares people, he believes he should probably just kill. He is awoken from his daydream by Rachel. It's really obvious how down horrendous she is for Ragna and wants to ride him, but she would never say it. Ragna's upset about her shape-shifting animal friends and starts to scrap with her. Their fight is interrupted by Valkenhayn. I know who this guy is, and he still isn't exciting to introduce. He calls Ragna dirty, poor, punk, and dips, and Rachel lets on she's always keeping an eye on him. Ragna's annoyed, but finds the 13th hierarchical city. In the sewers of the city, he finds Arakune, who recognizes the azure energy inside of his right arm. Azure is sort of the pure magic that comes from the boundary, which is where the cauldrons lead, which Ragna's out to destroy. Ragna wins the fight but is stopped by Lychee before he can finish Arakune off. From here, there are two potential choices. For this ending, you must choose option 1. He loses interest and leaves Lychee to sulk. He thinks about his past as he enters the cathedral, but he's bum-rushed by a manic Jin. He wins the fight but hesitates to finish Jin off. He's accosted by Hakumen at the boundary, who calls him Black Beast. Ragna's Azure Grimoire, aka his right arm, is freaking out, which makes him even more nervous to fighting his Hakumen. He holds his own, but the same Grimalkin, who keeps interrupting him, is in the arcade mode. He then vanishes into thin air. The cauldron opens and out comes Noelle? But evil, and sounding a lot more like new. Winning or losing the fight doesn't matter, because both outcomes lead to Noelle grappling onto Ragna and throwing themselves into the cauldron, with Jin not far behind them. Rachel looks on the whole situation with dismay and hints that the world is probably going to be baptized by fire and waits for the next time over. The theories of a timeline reset and Rachel being somehow above it all are all but true at this point. This justifies how each arcade mode story can be considered canonical if all of them were just a potential scenario that got rebooted at the end. For the second true ending, the events play out exactly the same, but you have to finish at least one of the fights between Rachel and Hakumen with a distortion or astral heat. If you do that, New comes out of the cauldron instead of Noelle. They exchange dialogue that's almost one-to-one with Ragna's arcade mode, and the ending is the same, with both of them plummeting inside. Rachel says the exact same dialogue. When fighting Arakune, choose the other option. Ragna and Lychee debate on if Arakune should be left alive. Lychee's heartfelt plea tugs at Ragna and he leaves them be. He runs into two different bounty hunters, Taukaka and Bang, who are both easily dispatched. He finds Hakumen once again, and their fight is the same. Key difference being Grimalkin, or Jubei as his name is, actually appears on screen. He and Ragna have a talk. He sends Ragna back to the restaurant with Tao, and the two dine and dash to avoid paying the bill. Jubei seems to be somewhat aware that we, the player, made some kind of wrong choice in the story, or at least Ragna did, because this is labeled as the normal ending and not a true ending. I'm unsure if this is one that can be considered just as canonical as the least, because the world doesn't end because Ragna doesn't fight New or Noelle, which seems to be the key factor in this. The bad ending has you follow the same path as the true endings, except you must finish with an astral or distortion for each fight. I am not doing that, so I'm stealing this clip off of YouTube. After Hakumen, you confront New, and after a fight, she somehow turns into Ragna? Ragna and New somehow fuse after this battle, which doesn't bode well for Noelle when she arrives. Normal Noelle, that is. Ragna harnesses his Azure Grimoire and becomes the Black Beast reborn and just eats Noelle on the spot. I guess Ragna's a Jinchuruki. The circumstances of Ragna's arm are left vague, but it has something to do with the Black Beast either being possessed or it's a piece of the beast somehow? I'm not sure. Jin's story picks up when he was adopted by the Kisaragi family, sometime after he went sicko mode and burned down his home and tried to kill Ragna. His nobility let him ace through his NOL academy life effortlessly, but he found himself isolated from his adoptive family and fellow students. Not that Jin minds. Jin is a huge cunt in just about every way and thinks that the average person is garbage. Jin's ability to obey orders is tested and broken when he heads to the 13th city to find the Reaper, whom he believes to be Ragna. On the way, he runs into Bang, who loathes Jin for his actions in the Ikaruga Civil War. It proclaims that the South Ikaruga will rise again. Jin wins pretty easily. You're given the option to spare him or put him out of his misery. Jin takes pity on him in option 1 and leaves him to toil. Heading into the main city, he runs into Carl Clover, who asks Jin to stop hunting Ragna so Carl himself can collect the bounty. Jin beats the child within an inch of his life and remarks how uncivilized it is to drop out of the academy. His search continues into the branch office, where Noelle Vermillion intercepts him and begs him to come back, telling him that his record will stay clean if he relents. Jin becomes overcome with rage because Noelle reminds him of someone, which seems to be a common theme with her, and he just outright kills her in cold blood. Sometimes Jin's personality tends to flip and he becomes extremely maniacal and likes to giggle over committing as much destruction as he can. He reveals it just like he did when he destroyed his childhood home, as he finds Ragna again the boundary, which leads to his narrow victory. When Nu crawls out of the boundary hole, his sword somehow implants memories into his head? He gets really mad at Nu and tries to kill her, which fails pretty hard. Nu brushes him off and she impales Ragna and they fall into the cauldron, with Jin not far behind. Are you beginning to see the recurring story elements? As Jin falls, he sees a glimpse of Rachel. He awakes, seemingly spared from the destruction of the world, at Rachel's feet, who asks him if he wants to become a true hero. The events in other characters' story modes are beginning to intertwine and become more and more connected the more we play. When facing Bang, choose the option to put him down like a dog. It's a little ambiguous, but Jin cuts his chest open. He has to be attended to by his ninja allies. Jin flees in order to not draw more attention to his incestuous mission. He goes deeper into town and finds Tager, who has major beef with him because of his NOL background, and you have to lose to Tager to progress? Yeah, okay. Rachel's two goons have dragged Jin to her Sonic Adventure 2 level castle home and calls him stupid and gay and pesters him for a fight. Right after that fight finishes, Jin is somehow transported to what I think is True Ending 1 timeline? He just killed Noelle in the same manner, so the same events with Ragna and Nu 13 ensue, like exactly the same as the last ending. After the Rachel scene, he is suddenly fighting with Hakumen with no explanation, and after the fight, it's finished. The ending's done. This might be the weirdest route in the entire game, with Jin just kind of popping up in random places. I'm combining both normal endings because they are quite similar. Normal ending 2, I think it was, you just have to lose to Nu at the end. The ending cutscene is an expanded version of his arcade ending, except Jin is apparently seeing flashes of current-day Noelle in his past. Ending 1 has Jin lose to Ragna, which disturbs him greatly because he keeps getting flashes to, I think, his different timelines? Or different points in time? Because he really wants to tell Ragna that he shouldn't fight Nu. He really wants to tell him. We get a new flashback to his academy life, where Jin has beaten the misogyny accusations by being kind to his childhood friend Tsubaki. He speaks briefly to her in her friend group, which includes Noelle and, Squirrel? Jin gets another flashback of current Noelle and freaks out, but Noelle gets a current flash of Jin? Jin is clearly under some kind of manipulation, likely from Rachel, trying to gear him into becoming a hero, or at least fitting whatever role she wants him to be, and that involves taking some kind of temporal brainwashing or programming. His story is very surreal and takes on a much creepier atmosphere with a lot of references to mind manipulation and potential war crimes committed by the NOL. And speaking of the NOL and being easily manipulated, the white void of her arcade ending is back, along with Rachel. Noelle awakes from her dream instead of a ship, prepping to land inside the 13th city. Her mission to retrieve Jin from going AWOL is halted by her radio communicator breaking, but she's being led by someone from the intelligence division, Hazama. Yeah, I don't trust this guy, look at this crooner. The two run into Carl when they arrive at the landing port. Kyle tries to get information out of Noelle, which she refuses to give. He decides to later beat it out of her. Hazama ducks the fight and claims he isn't good at fighting. Please remember this fact for later. Noelle trounces Carl fairly easily and he takes off. Hazama notices that the doll Carl has is a Nox Nectoris, which are the strongest weapons crafted back in the Dark War against the Black Beast. He points out that Noelle's twin guns are also of the same craft and notes that they sometimes have psychological drawbacks, boldly stating that Carl's personality has been altered somehow because of his doll, which opens a curious case about Noelle's personality and how her weapon might be affecting it. Noelle, trying to find the NOL branch in the office, runs to Tager. After the fight, Noelle's eyes are darkened and she doesn't quite seem herself, following up on the personality influence Hazama talked about. Though this implies that Noelle isn't strong enough to beat Tager without being influenced somehow, which is hilarious. She runs into Bang, who is pissed because he and Carl somehow knew each other. He claims Carl as a disciple, but who knows if Bang is really ever telling the truth. Speaking of Bang fibbing, he fakes his defeat for some reason and lets Noelle go. I think he was testing her resolve or something. It's a very weird scene, but also hilariously unbecoming of Noelle. That she can't even tell Bang was pulling his punches and faking his own defeat. Noelle is kind of a helpless scamp, isn't she? She meets up with Hazama in the empty branch office, but is intercepted by Jin. After winning the fight, the cauldron bursts open, and Nu arrives and identifies Noelle as herself? Noelle goes all robotic and the two scrap. The connections were becoming increasingly obvious, but now there's no denying the connection between Noelle and Nu. Is Nu some kind of future version of Noelle? She's at least somewhat connected to her through Nu being a robot does present a lot of issues. We see flashbacks of Noelle's childhood from her and other characters' perspectives, so unless those memories were altered or somehow falsified, she was able to grow up, which doesn't seem to be a trait of the units. Nu decides to just delete Noelle from existence. Hazama was watching this whole thing bewildered. He spots a spying Rachel and frowns. Assumedly, Rachel is here to view the timeline what's happening, and Hazama is somehow aware of this as well. You must lose to Tager to get this ending. Honestly, I don't even think a summary is worth it, because this is like a joke ending. What happens is that Noelle goes to Lychee's clinic after Tager drops her off, Bang accidentally calls her breasts small, and she enacts police brutality. Lychee chases her around to make her dress up like Guilty Gear characters, and she gets Tao-tangled. Noelle lets herself get dressed up, she gets to play with Lychee's pet panda, which brings the ending to a close. Follow exactly the same path as the first normal ending, except win every fight with a distortion. Between each fight, Noelle comments that her guns do all the fighting for her, which leaves her mind to dwell on her past memories in the academy with her two friends, Tsubaki and Makoto. Dealing with the discrimination of beastmen, which is what Makoto is, the family status, and her relationship with her parents. At the end, she confronts Nu, which reveals that Noelle has some kind of childhood amnesia which prevents her from recalling much of her early childhood that isn't in the flashbacks. The mirror reflection with her and Nu is a pretty obvious metaphor, but it makes her connections to Jin and Ragna's younger sister a lot more curious. Both her and Nu are said to resemble her greatly, and given that Noelle can't remember much of her earlier years, we're going to see some kind of revelation about that, I suspect. My leading theory is that Noelle is some kind of super advanced aging android built in her image. As was Nu, but Nu seems to be built for battle, which Noelle wasn't. At least not entirely. Rachel is chilling with Valkenheim in her castle in Nowhere Land when she notices an irregularity in the stars, which hints at the world's fiery fate. She teleports away, leaving Valkenheim to his own devices. His alone time is interrupted by some kind of green boy who taunts him about an ambiguous past together. He leaves, and Valkenheim gets an uneasy feeling about Rachel's adventures on Earth. I love the metaphor about stars being used to represent the fate of the Earth. It really adds an extra dimension on how transcendent some characters are from the threads of fate. This route also introduces a new player into the story, this green boy. Rachel teleports into the 13th city, which shocks Carl, who happened to be standing there. He innocuously asked if Rachel was a witch, which offends her greatly. She stomps him out promptly. Carl's doll reacts rather negatively to Rachel, which is unusual because it typically doesn't react to anything outside of battle. However, it may communicate it thinks Rachel is bad news. Rachel wins the fight and leaves the broken Carl to his own devices. This kid cannot catch a break. Valkenheim teleports in and takes Carl to a clinic while having a conversation with the doll, whose name is Nirvana, or Ada, as Carl calls it. I have so little clue what's going on. And speaking of not knowing what's going on, Rachel just teleports into the branch office right after Noelle and Jin got into a fight where Noelle was the victor. Rachel provokes a tired Noelle by insulting her eyes, then her guns, then implies she doesn't have any autonomy without them, which is an eerily accurate prediction given how big of a role they seem to play and allow her to win some fights. She attacks her to prove if Noelle has any power to change the outcome of the world, which I interpret to being saving the world and not having everything reset when Ragna and Nu fight. Noelle loses and Rachel snatches her Dracos away. I always thought Noelle was kind of a helpless idiot, but I kind of felt bad for her in this part.
So please, give him back! No. Why do you have to be so mean to me? Why?
Rachel dips immediately after. She ends up in the boundary somewhere with Hakumen, which she didn't expect him to be there. I think she poofs him somewhere else? I'm going to assume she just operates on fairy godparent logic. Boundary opening dashes Rachel hopes for saving the world, and the Green Boy showing up doesn't help either. She accuses the Green Boy of being the puppet master of why the world keeps blowing up, which he doesn't entirely deny. They argue, he dips, and then Ragna shows up. The two share a touching scene after the fight. Ragna seems at least somewhat aware of her outsider nature during all of this. The route ends with Rachel awakening from a nightmare back in her castle, ready to repeat the cycle over again. Choosing the second option, Rachel decides to hurt Carl even more, which draws Bang's attention, who had spotted the fight happening the whole time. She has no interest in him and tries to teleport away, but Bang hijacks her teleporting. They end up elsewhere in the city. Rachel notices that Bang carries a Nox Nectaurus weapon just like Noel, which means he has an important role to play later in the story, at least according to Rachel. She engages him in a brief fight, then teleports away, but her teleportation is a bit wonky. She is warped into the sewers where one of her familiars is almost eaten by a hungry Arakune. After she wins the fight, she and later Valkenhayn determines the timeline is kind of boned anyway, so they go back home. Rachel ponders on her family and wonders if she is truly worthy to be the heir to the Alucard family. Follow the exact same path as normal ending 1, except choose the second option when fighting Hakumen. Green Boy shows up and says something about Kokonoe, Tager's boss, would know about. Rachel thinks and teleports away. She bothers Tager to unlock the secret entrance to her hidey hole, which is won in a fight. She finds Kokonoe, who is another cat person, but not as much as a cat person as Taukaka. There's a sliding scale of how furry one is in Blazblue. She tells Kokonoe some tips and tricks for the next time over because she's already out of time for the world's fate. We then find out the Green Boy's name is Terumi, which upsets Kokonoe, who apparently used to know him, or at least knows of him. Observant viewers will remember that Terumi was the manual's prologue name as one of the 6 heroes. So we know that Jubei, Hakumen, and Terumi were the first half of the heroes, but characters like Kokonoe and Valkenhayn have unspoken beef with the factions, which really activates the almonds. Rachel narrates that she isn't able to take direct actions on Earth, but rather has to subtly push things in the right direction. Her eyes are on people with Nox weapons, so Noel, Bang, and potentially Carl, Ragna, and especially Jin. She laments about her fate as an audience member rather than a cast member. This chapter was incredible, so many details were revealed, and we finally got a grasp on Rachel's motivations. God, the joke character gets her own story? Okay. Also, she's tied for the greatest number of endings in the story, and most of them are joke routes anyways. Normal ending 1 has Town try and find Ragna to turn him in for his bounty. She runs into Ragna, doesn't recognize him. She runs into Rachel and Noel, somehow. The only thing of note in her first ending is meeting Jubei, who is revealed to be kind of a deadbeat dad to the Kaka clan. The second ending has her fighting robot versions of Tager and herself with no explanation. She runs into Bang and there's this whole story about her becoming a ninja disciple, then Bang dying and Tao seeking revenge on his behalf. I straight up don't remember if anything else is different in her third ending to the second one compared to her just trying to eat Bang. The true ending at least has some lore snippets. All you have to do is select option 2 right at the start and you're good. She and Lighchi just accidentally run into Hakumen after a brief Arakune squabble. The fact the path to the boundary is just right around the corner from Lost Town where the Kaka people live is hilarious. She runs into Kokonoe for some reason, who tells her that cat people like her are more like cousins in the gross incestuous Kaka clan. Tao is shot down back home and eats a bunch of expired meat. And that's the true ending. I'm serious. I appreciate that we do have a joke character in the roster, but why make her story, which is not meant to be taken seriously at all, a compulsory mechanic to getting the final chapter? It seems a bit silly, no? The Red Devil of Sector 7 was on a mission from Kokonoe to set up a ghetto space-time warp to bring Hakumen back to their lab, as well as to locate the Azure Grimoire, aka Ragna's arm, if possible. He loses connection with Kokonoe and runs into Taukaka. He trots away and walks through the city, only to run into Bang, who declares that his vibes are off and attempts to attack him. Bang is defeated and Tager moves on. In Orient Town, he finds Lighchi and considers bringing her in to resume her position as Kokonoe's assistant. She tells him to kick rocks, so Tager stomps her out. Their fight is interrupted by Jubei of all people, who tells Tager not to worry about it and to leave, which he does. Inside the branch office, he and Jin square off. They talk about Jin's war crimes in the Ikaruga Civil War, and apparently Jin doesn't remember committing them. Either he's capping, or his memories are being altered or removed of the events. If Tager is victorious, he moves on to the Boundary, where he finds Hakumen. Hakumen asks why Sector 7 wants to remove all the Seether in the world, knowing just how much humanity depends on the energy to survive. Tager doesn't know, but he also doesn't care. Winning the fight, we also find out that Hakumen keeps disappearing because of Kokonoe's ghetto teleporter, and apparently she is also a Grimalkin? I don't know if I should consider that an in-game slur or not. Ragna shows up after Tager and just does not care and leaves right away. He gets a phone call from Kokonoe, who is unusually emotional talking to him because she knows the world is going to die quite soon once Ragna's finished with his business at the Boundary. Following the exact same steps as the True End, but just lose to Jin. Their fight is interrupted by Arakune for some reason. Jin takes off and Tager scraps with the Blobby Boy. Right after the fight, the Black Beast awakens and just eats Arakune after the air, and presumably Noelle if it follows to the same timeline as Ragna's Bad End. This came the hell out of nowhere and it's awesome. All you need to do is finish Bang with a Distortion or Astral. Bang activates his super mode and beats Tager's ass so hard he has to run. After being repaired, Bang finds Tager again, but Kokonoe installs some upgrades and turns him into Golden Tager. Tager's blasts are destroying the Kaka village, so Kokonoe guilts Bang into taking the blast and intentionally losing the fight. She remarks how interesting it would be to experiment on Bang's body afterwards. Lychee's story mode comes before Arakune's, but I've elected to do his first because his story unlocks part of Lychee's story for some reason. As far as I know, no other character has a weird stipulation like this. He also has an insane number of branching decisions to make, even if most of them are just eat this dude or nah. So I can summarize this all pretty quickly. His dialogue is usually fragmented and choppy, but I turned on an option in the settings to have it be readable. Not that it changes his ability to communicate with anyone, or that his dialogue makes any sense to begin with. True Ending has Arakune eat Tager, Taukaka, all of the Kaka children, Ragna, then Lychee. Choose all first options. He runs into Hakumen, then Hakumen just rips Ragna right out of him, and then they scrap. Winning to Hakumen has Hakumen teleport away, have Arakune remember Kokonoe and really want to kill her, and then I think Nu kills him? I think. Normal ending is the same route, except you lose to Hakumen. Oh, I guess Lychee wasn't eaten after all. Hakumen knows how to kill Arakune, somehow. Ending 2 is the exact same thing, but you just choose the options not to eat anyone. Ending 3 just has Noelle throw him in the garbage after shooting him. No character or plot development to report here, you just need to meet Hakumen in a story for Lychee's to function properly. And here where I should mention there isn't any way to tell which endings reveal any interesting details about the world building or story, and some are just kind of there by necessity. If they chose to include story mode for all 12 characters, I figured some would only be there for fun, but the lack of any way to tell is a huge misstep. After a long day's work in the office, Lychee departs the upper layers of the city, looking for Ragna. She runs into Taukaka, who says she got a free meal out of him in Orient Town. Lychee hears a suspicious noise, but chooses to ignore it. Choosing the first option, she finds Ragna and manages to convince him not to kill Arakune on the spot before he takes off. Satisfied with a day's worth of work, she intends to leave until she runs into Noelle. Somehow, she convinces Noelle that despite talking to Ragna moments ago, that was actually her brother who dresses up as Ragna. Noelle somehow buys this and leaves her alone. You're just terminally stupid, aren't you? Lychee heads to the Kaka clan's village and follows up on some research she conducted at the behest of the tribe's elder. We learn that the Kaka tribe was specifically beastmen bred for warfare and have eugenics hard-coded into them to prevent their numbers from going too high or too low. They reproduce by essentially asexual cloning. Their elder remarks that they are forsaken by capital G God and that no new souls are being born, just repeating the same lives until they all die for good. I was not expecting an insane lore dump on the Kaka tribe, but we do have one. That also explains Tao's mental state. The Kaka aren't known for their smarts, but given that they clone themselves after a certain point, Tao might just be the result of too many clones. I also have to ask, what on earth was Jubei thinking with these things? How did he do this? Choosing the third option, Lychee fumbles the Rogna bag and runs into Bang, who may or may not have been spying on her. She speaks to some of the children of Ron and Guy, who revealed that their boss Bang has been responsible for most of Ikaruga's survivors not being slaughtered, and he personally helped build them and their community for them, which really adds a tragic angle to his character. Considering Jin is the hero of the town he apparently helped raise and destroy, rather than someone who helped save it from its expanding imperialism. I was just joking about the American Civil War comparisons beforehand, but now? I don't know, man. Hope you got Arakune's and Lychee's endings proper, otherwise this one just doesn't work. If you choose to investigate the sound at the beginning, you will find a completely missable fight between Carl that tells us that Nirvana, his doll, is a war weapon and might not even be his sister. This is entirely optional and does not need to be fought under any circumstances. But you do miss some adorable interactions between Carl and Tao. Lychee fumbles Rogna again by choosing the second option and ends up in a fight you must win with a distortion drive. Rogna dips right after. Jubei, from the shadows, somehow knows that Lychee has used the boundary power for herself. Lychee explains that she just wants the power to change fate and revert Arakune from whatever he is now. Jubei tells her where to find him. Lychee considers Mercy killing him to quell her own feelings about the situation, but chooses to spare him and write a letter to Kokonoe for aid. She gazes at the stars and spots a shooting star, signifying the end of the world. Lychee's stories are all over the place, but they all end with a very somber tone that resonated with me a lot. Her story is complicated, but beautifully tragic and heartwarming at the same time. We open to a flashback of the Ikaruga Civil War 4 years ago. Bang is fending off the library, but not killing anyone because his master's philosophy dictates it so. He runs into Jin, who has seemingly killed Bang's master, and Jin scars his face. Bang chases after Rogna to claim the bounty and rebuild his country with the money. He runs into his crush and Tager speaking on the way. He confronts Tager in a jealous rage, but is eager to follow Lychee after Tager encouraged him to. And he totally ships Lychee with Bang. He runs into Rogna by pure coincidence, and Rogna just loses the fight intentionally just to have Bang leave him alone because he's really preoccupied at the moment. He finds her inside the sewers dwelling with Arakune, which Bang inserts himself into, hoping that Lychee feels the same way about him. After winning the fight, we can diverge endings from here. In the heat of the moment, Bang confesses to Lychee, who doesn't really understand the situation and just ends up friend-zoning him. Bang leaves positively shell-shocked until he runs into Jin. He tends to find people he's looking for very quickly. Bang chooses to keep beating Jin after he wins the fight, which makes his sword overreact and cause an ice storm. Noelle is in hot pursuit and tries to arrest Bang, which fails because Noelle is just a massive failure. Bang tries to melt the ice with a fire technique, but he spread too much fire and caused a lot of property damage. Bang leaves quickly and thinks about his master. Instead of choosing to beat up Jin after the fight, he bites his tongue on his revenge and questions him about the NOL, which goes poorly because Jin tells him to kick rocks and leaves. The topic of Rogna is brought up, naturally, and Bang races to try and find him again. Somehow, Bang ends up in the Alucard Castle? I don't know, man. I don't know how he got there. Rachel and her gang ask Bang to die and or leave, which Bang takes offense to. After being mildly impressed with Bang's strength, they give him a tip of info. The son of Bang's master, Sir Tenjo, is apparently alive, though they note that the info is old and it might be outdated. Bang is teleported away from the castle and takes the info to heart and leaves everything behind to go search for Tenjo's son. It's kind of astounding that Bang leaves everything behind that he built just for a hunch. Leaving behind his feelings for Lychee, the community he built, even his revenge for Jin is left at the wayside, which makes it even more tragic because the world ending would prevent him from ever finding anything more. After you beat Arakune, choose to clear your head before confessing. Lychee will dip and Bang will try and track her down. Lychee finds Tao and tells her that Bang either has info on Rogna or meat buns to get Tao to distract him as she chases Arakune. After beating Tao, Bang's thirst for being a libertarian guy with an Asian wife leads him to the boundary, where Hakumen is prepared to slash Arakune and Lychee down together. Bang blocks the attacks and faces him in battle. Hakumen is so pissed that he forgets his duties and puts all of his strength into killing Bang because he pissed him off that much. Bang casually asks Lychee on a date while she and Arakune escape, which she agrees to. We cut to the Tao village, where the roof has broken because of Bang and Hakumen's battle. and Bang's story has been immortalized as a tale of heroism along the tribe. The last shot is of them saluting their hero, who smiles down at them from heaven. God, that is adorable. Last but probably least is Carl Clover. Carl talks to Nirvana, or Ada, about capturing Ragnar for his Azure Arm. Carl runs into Taukaka, who decides to throw hands with him for the lols. Winning the fight, he retrieves deeper into the city. Tager runs into him and is shocked to find out that he owns Nirvana. For this ending, you can run away from Tager entirely and just not fight him. Suddenly, Carl is teleported to Rachel, who thinks he should probably just die and is ugly and stupid and worthless, but wants to test his strength, presumably because of Nirvana. But with a handicap, Carl can't use Nirvana in a fight. Rachel's at a fraction of the health normally, so she's no sweat. She awards Carl with some info. Gathering more Nox weapons is going to potentially aid his cause in somehow fixing his sister. You're given the choice to confront either Jin or Noelle and get the same ending. I chose Noelle and robbed her guns. Carl finds Ragnar at the boundary after being stabbed by Nu. After a fight with her, Carl figures out he just can't win against her. Nu decides to completely shatter Nirvana into countless pieces, which also shatters Carl's psyche. As Ragnar and Nu plummet into the cauldron and end the world, Carl spends his last moments with the remains of his robotic sister in his arms. Simply select the option to fight Tager instead of run. Tager tries to capture Nirvana, which makes Carl freak out and attack him. God, I hate fighting Carl. After the fight, Carl flees and passes out, only to be rescued by Bang. Bang feels really bad for Carl because he thinks he's a traumatized basket case and takes him under his vigilante wing, which Carl begrudgingly obliges to take. We finally got an origin to Bang's trafficking ring, Carl's apprenticeship. Okay, get this. You have to lose to Taukaka in the beginning to get this ending. Hilarious. She drags you to Lychee's clinic. Carl's far too proud to stay any longer than he absolutely needs to, so he leaves in a hurry, which causes Lychee to follow after him. The Rachel segment is done exactly the same as the other endings. I chose Jin this time around, and Carl had no hesitation to boot gang his sword and kill him in the process. The fight with Nu is exactly the same, but Lychee jumps in the way for an attack meant for Nirvana, and Lychee sacrifices herself. Seeing his sister and Lychee, Carl breaks down again while the world comes to an end. I am so sorry for any Carl fans out there. There is nothing good in store for this kid at all. Even Rachel remarks that this kid is probably just doomed to die and make all the wrong choices. And that marks the traditional 10 characters needed to unlock the last two, Hakumen and Nu. I don't actually think you need the true endings of each character, but just any ending will do. I unlocked these right after I got the normal ending with Carl, who was my last choice. Let's see why they've been hidden from the start. Let's go with Hakumen. Hakumen's story isn't long, but is full of dense explanations and lore, so bear with me here. Hakumen is resting inside of a section of the boundary called the Edge when he is contacted by Kokonoe. Some kind of jargon she mentions makes him assume she's a witch, then comes to the insane conclusion that she's the daughter of someone named Nine and the Cat, which can only mean Jubei. Given how he knew that Jubei was in the Dark War, which we now know happened 19 years ago, it isn't shocking. Jubei confronts him, which also confirms my theory that Grimalkin is some kind of slur for beastmen. Jubei asks that Hakumen doesn't tell Kokonoe about him, which is hilarious, considering how much of a deadbeat dad he is. But an important question is raised. How is Jubei alive? The Dark War was almost a century ago, so did he just do some time skullduggery, or do beastmen just age slow? He also tells him that Terumi is back and he needs to die right away. Hilarious to consider that despite being one of the heroes, every other hero really wants Terumi to die, and we don't even know what the hell he did yet. Because of some time dilation effects where Hakumen has to go through some kind of self-actualization process to be properly formed in the timeline? Think of the metaphor of Marty McFly disappearing because he won't exist. He teleports from place to place. He runs into Bang, who recognizes him as a member of the 6 heroes and asks for a friendly spar. Bang's resolve is to restore his home nation and protect the people close to him, which earns Hakumen's respect. He recalls not liking Bang when he was human, which is interesting. Hold on to that for now. After he wins, Hakumen is accosted by Rachel, who tells him that Nu has been spotted in the boundary and Rachel might have been responsible for waking her up somehow. For some reason, we also find out that the Murakumo units are intended for sort of some kind of boundary explanation and god-cutting blade. That's the best we're getting. I don't know. Another teleport and he's at the boundary and runs into Tager, sent to retrieve him. It's this fight that determines the ending you get. Hakumen wins and explains to Tager that he has something called a causality phenomenon device, which somehow interacts with Hakumen's fragile existence in the current timeline, which grants a limited power called quantum superpositional manipulation. BlazBlue's story is infamous for blindsiding players with insane technobabble out of nowhere, and nowhere is it more binding and insane than Hakumen's story. Hakumen is warped into some kind of mental inner reality, made possible through the boundary, like a sort of dream world that you can interact with people in the real reality with. I am so beyond lost with this plot. He runs into Dream Ragna, which makes Hakumen both nostalgic and sad. Once he wins a fight, he cherishes the time he had with Ragna as his brother. You might be seeing where this is going. He is able to will his past self, who is Jin Kisaragi. First of all, how'd that happen? What the hell kind of training did Jin go through to turn Rachel into a cyborg? But also, how did Jin get sent back to the past? Hakumen was a hero of the Dark War 90 years before the story, so did Jin get put into the robot body, sent back in time, trapped inside of the boundary, then come out again? I must also point out that he and Jin have the exact same voice actor, so the twist might have been a little more blatant in retrospect.
Where will I find myself this time? Shall I return to the edge again? Or perhaps to the depths of the boundary?
The NOL has already issued a Level D alert for Kagutsuchi. I'm sure you're aware. That means all organizations must suspend activity until further notice.
No time for questions, because they won't be answered in this ending. Hakumen frees himself from the boundary correctly, I think, and meets with Kokonoe. They both hate each other, and she only wants him for his body. Literally. His robot body is called Susanoo, and she needs it for Terumi, presumably. Hope you liked all that, because it wasn't even the true ending. Losing to Tager, yeah, I know, also as you teleport away, this time to Rachel's castle. Rachel actually seems pretty cool with him, even if she's just proud of her work of turning Jin into whatever he is now. They spar and she restores his ability to exist in the current reality somewhat, and he buckles down and waits for the opportunity to cleanse the world of its sins, which I assume means he's waiting for Ragna to arrive at the boundary. What happened to Jin's sword? The ice sword. Hakumen is a different blade, so did Jin get a trade offer? Where the hell is Hazama? Or Terumi for that matter? What's going on? Last character story of all. Remember when I said I had no idea what was going on? Yeah, get ready to feel that again. We see New inside of the Azure inside the boundary. We see a young Noelle, or Saya? New tends to just float from place to place, not really knowing why she's there. She runs into Carl, who wants to take the Azure inside of her for himself. New smashes Nirvana to pieces after a fight together and floats away. She ends up in the branch office and meets a strangely familiar Jin, who acts like she is Saya, and they still live together as a church in the family. Her, Jin, and Ragna. I think someone gets a memory of Ragna killing New in a previous timeline. I think. This is where the timeline splits depending on how you win the fight. Jin seems a little aware of it because he flips the script and instantly tries to kill her and calls her for fabrication when he loses. New subdues but doesn't kill him. She floats to the boundary and meets robotic Noelle, who confirms her as identical, assuming that means they're just the exact same. Guess Noelle's a robot now. Noelle calls New a clone after New wins the fight, which makes her really cheesed off and she just wipes her off the face of the earth. New recalls Saya's memories as Ragna's comes to the boundary, and a repeat of the arcade final fight, and I think Ragna's final fight happens, where they pierce each other, fall into the cauldron, and Jin tries to catch them. You get used to seeing this scene a lot because it's happened like 6 times. You still have to win against Jin for the true ending, but you must win with a distortion or astral. After the confrontation, New wakes up in the Azure, implying that all the events prior were just a dream, or something like that. Somehow Arakune is inside the Azure? He just shows up and wants to eat New. New seems to ask permission to go into battle mode, but no answers are given who she's talking to, if anyone at all. The two exit, and Arakune is slaughtered. New is confronted by Unlimited Rachel, who tells her something similar to our arcade ending, that she's dreaming and needs to wake up, and that she's going off script. After a fight, New is presumably back in the boundary asleep, dreaming of Ragna and Noelle. Okay, if I don't voice it now, I will probably forget, but I really wish there was a way to tell which endings are important and which ones aren't. I was going to get all of the endings regardless, but for players who don't want to spend a lot of time doing that, I think there should be some kind of system implemented that at least nudged you in the right direction. Some true and normal endings work best if you get the normal first, then true, but you're asking a lot of the average player to engage with an already confusing system. But now, we've got all the true endings. Here we go. The true end tends to jump from perspective to perspective quite quickly, so I really hope you've been making notes for each character's stories. Or, at the very least, Ragna's, Noelle's, and Rachel's. The true ending begins before Ragna's even made it into the city. Ragna's walking through the Seether clouds when he meets Jubei. Jubei warns him that his old pupil that something quite dangerous will happen soon, and when he knows, he'll know. Ragna heeds the warning and still heads to the city to smash the cauldron. We jump to Noelle and Hazama, who have just arrived in the city. They decide to spend some time investigating and asking questions before nightfall, when Ragna plans to attack. They discuss the missing Major Kisaragi and his weird obsession with Ragna. Cut to Jin, who has made it to the branch office, noticing how empty it is. Ragna is teleported by Rachel, who tests his skills in a fight and teleports him to the branch office, where she so obviously simps for him. Which he still doesn't seem to notice.
Jin!
I hope that cutscene startled you, because it sure did startle me. Reminder that the audio for the anime-style cutscenes don't fall under the universal audio settings for some reason. Also, the art quality is, Ragna v Unlimited Jin is underway. Ragna seems to be getting flashes of past timelines into his head, which is confusing. He snatches a dub and leaves Jin alive for future questioning, and because he can't bring himself to kill his brother. Noelle and Hazama catch up and find a knocked out Jin. Hazama doesn't care about Ragna's affairs, but Noelle's filled with adrenaline and leaves Hazama behind to go search for Ragna. Ragna runs into Hakumen and remembers Jubei's wise words. The two fight each other, but Hakumen is teleported away, or is he? He resists Kokonoe's warping, which shocks the hell out of her. She advises Ragna to leave, and he somehow hears it? I thought she was using some kind of relay or microphone to talk, but it seems a lot more like telepathy. Ragna's forced to take dire action.
I didn't want to use this, but... Restriction 666 released. Dimensional interruption imaginary number formed. Azure Grimoire, activated! Take this, you son of a bitch!
Unlimited Ragna v Hakumen is underway. Noelle is getting consistent past memories beamed into her head as she makes her way to the cauldron. When it opens and new emerges, she goes into robot mode and reveals herself as Unit 12, Anti-Sankishin Unit Core? Which would put her ahead of new 13 Murokuma Unit, I think? Ragna takes over the fight with Nu, which doesn't go super well because he's still impaled by her, and the two fall into the boundary. Noelle defies fate. The two share a tearful moment, but Ragna doesn't actually know who Noelle is at all, and neither does Noelle, so it's a bit awkward. Noelle literally cries herself to sleep, and Rachel inserts herself in the situation. Rachel calls Noelle the Eye, which is intended to inherit the Azure, unlike Ragna's weird arm. She says things are going crazy and not to worry about it for now, but then she decides to do this. Noelle seems to forget what happened. She tries to arrest Ragna on the spot until he arrives. Hazama, I think he just sat on the side and watched this all happen, gets possessed, I think, by Terami. Everyone loses their minds because it's revealed that Terami was the one who burned down Ragna's childhood church and caused the domino effect that destroyed his life. He then leaves. If you have any questions about this, I'm sorry, but the game is over here. Yeah, the game just kind of ends. Hope you weren't looking for everything to be tied up in a nice bow. Oh, yeah, there is an after-credits scene. Noelle's academy friend, Tsubaki, is called into Hazama's office because she's been assigned a super-secret mission from the Imperator, the head of the NOL, so essentially the God King of the world. The task, assassinate Noelle and Jin. Now the story is over. There aren't many stories that can be described in the exact same phrase when you start it and when you finish it, but CT's can, and that phrase is, what the hell is going on? Oh yeah, first I must talk about Teach Me Miss Lychee. Right after the saves menu is a smaller visual novel that acts as an in-universe glossary to explain lore, events, and world building. If you're asking why I never brought it up until now, it's because I had no idea. Nothing in the game points to it, in my knowledge. I watched the introduction on my Xbox, but you have to get certain parts of the story to unlock more episodes, I'm pretty sure. What are those certain points? No idea. Instead of being a list of terms and nouns, it follows a non-canonical story of Lychee teaching Taukaka about the world they live in, from locations and magic and whatnot. And some of these details you may put together from playing your story on the own, but some are only really obtainable through this optional mode. You are not told at a single point in the story that Valkenhayn and Jubei know each other and go way back unless you played this mode. The best and most thorough explanations of what Ars Magus is, how Seether works, and how the NOLs run is featured here, not in the campaign. This is hardly a bad idea on paper. It allows for anyone who's curious to brush up on the in-universe lexicon without having awkward moments in the story where characters have to explain concepts that they would otherwise already know. But the execution is clumsy because half of each novel segment is sandwiched between goofy character interactions. Entertaining? Certainly. Distracting? Absolutely. I'd rather have this mode than not have it, but its implementation is clunkier than I'd like it by quite a long mile. I just don't think I should learn how a fictional government dictatorship works sandwiched between jokes about Noelle's breast size. Now that I've addressed that, I want to talk about how I feel about the story as a whole. Forgive me for how scattershot everything is, because I really can't pick a place to start. How about the final novel segment? Can you tell me what's different about this and Ragna's true ending? Noelle grabbing his hand and Hazama showing up. Details about Kokonoe and Terami wouldn't hit nearly as hard if the game simply started here, obviously. But is it not a bit silly all it took to overcome fate was Noelle, of all people, grabbing Ragna's hand and letting New just fall into the soupy soup cauldron? Noelle? Dumb as a brick Noelle? What happened to Hakumen in the final story? Did Bro just dip after Ragna wiped the floor with him? If I had to point out my single biggest complaint about the story, it's the lack of answers. I am well aware that CT is very much a setup game meant to establish set pieces and characters, but if that was the purpose, why muddle it with such a complicated and convoluted time travel plot? The time travel is also a victim of this. How can some people remember past events in different timelines and some don't? I can accept Rachel knowing, but how on earth would Ragna just suddenly get a headache and remember something that version of him never did? Is he psychic? Was there an insane explanation for it that I missed somewhere in a losing scenario against someone in a story route? So many characters just feel tacked on. I love some of these side characters, but it does feel kind of awkward that Hakumen has such a large slice of development revealed to be Jin sent back in time and now the future, and he still gets his ass kicked. He slew the Black Beast, who is Ragna, I think? Not sure how that works, but how come Ragna never finds out? Would it not be a lot tenser to have a final confrontation between brothers in the second to last fight of the game chronologically? I really wish some characters got more screen time. I know damn well there would be a main cast that we should focus on, but a lot of them are just there for world building. Not everyone needs equal attention and huge fleshed out character arcs, but was there really nothing to be done with Arakune in the main story? Apparently whatever business Rachel has with the knock weapons can wait, because Carl and Bang might as well be sitting on their thumbs for the main plot. Oh yeah, weird question, what's up with vampires? Rachel has so much going on with her that being a vampire is something I often forget about, but people just seem to know that off the bat and not care. Her family sits in some kind of outer world castle, and I don't think we get much of an answer for how old anyone is. I think vampires are ageless or something. Not many franchises can have vampire as a tertiary character trait. I just don't understand why they would go through so many wonderful world building and great character moments for the story mode for individual cast members if it doesn't show up and come into play, at least not yet. I understand that a sequel was already in the works in this game, but I don't think it was a super wise idea to put all of your chips on the first game doing Iron Man numbers and then just elaborating later. What does Calamity Trigger even mean? Is it a place or a person? I guess it's new, because her dying with Ragna is what caused the calamity of ending the Earth, so I guess she's the trigger? If someone stopped playing here, they would be so lost. Terminology is so dense, there is so many complicated Latin that it drives me up the wall because I am not educated enough to try and pronounce it without looking like a tool. Though I feel like the NOL wouldn't mind. An appendix would have made that just such easier. I've been quite critical of a lot of little and large details about the story, but I would like to say that I still enjoyed my time with it, even if that time was under the wing of an internet guide written decades ago. It might not be fair to praise it if it's compulsory to have a guide with it, but hopping from story to story and filling in the blanks about the world and plot was something I still found very entertaining and satisfying. I haven't played many visual novels, mostly limited to whatever Spike Chunsoft churns out, but I felt the novel segments were just functional, aside from the missing music, that is. The speed up button works fine, you can hide the menu, changes, and tweak small settings like the text box transparency and turn off individual character voices in case you really hated one character in particular, but it does feel pretty bare bones, even compared to similar games in the time frame. I do applaud the story mode for being in this style over a more cinematic experience that awkwardly flip-flops between cutscenes and gameplay like the Mortal Kombat games do. The world of BlazBlue is incredibly interesting, and the slower pace of the novel style really accentuates that. Our own world cultures are alive but have mutated into something that feels fresh and familiar with their own distinct flair. Healthy doses of Asian and European architecture, mythology, aristocracy, and character designs really help hammer home the state of the world. A crumbled ruin of what it once was, totally dominated by a totalitarian world government risen from war. To put a very complicated story lightly, I liked it quite a lot. I liked the main cast, for the most part, and it managed to be thrilling, funny, compelling, and other big words, even if it was kind of a chore to experience it in the best way possible. If they just added multiple save slots per character, there would be so much less stress in the whole situation. Or just do what Zero Escape does. Zero Escape is a series deeply involved with time travel and alternate timelines. It has an extremely useful flowchart that shows you exactly what actions lead to what scenarios, and you can jump from event to event as long as you've played them at least once. It does require a player to be very involved and aware of that narrative to keep with the swapping scenarios depending how radically you choose to jump ahead or back. The story is a beast. A black beast even. It's confusing, messy, complicated, thorough, conflicting, contemporary, and satisfying, and I love it for that. It's incredibly unique and stands out in a crowd in ways that no other narrative can really claim, which inherently makes it more memorable. It was a tough pill to swallow at times, but it was a pill I came to cherish and respect for how much work was put into it. This story was made in the course of over a year, too. The arcades didn't have story mode, so Team Blue put a tremendous amount of work into making this visual novel game mode to tell their tale the way they wanted to. I've yet to see any developer interview or insights on how they plot out the story, but there is an absolute method behind the madness. All of the pieces are in place, and it's now up to the next game to use them effectively, and that's why I love the story. And that's all I have to say on the matter. As much as I would like to drag my feet and talk about every single detail to lengthen this Titanic script even longer, I gotta cut it off somewhere. I know I've just sung the praises and critiqued the story mode, but there is a little secret I haven't told anyone so far. In Blazblue Continuum Shift, the direct sequel, there's a part of the story called Calamity Trigger Reconstruction, which tells a much shorter, much more focused and abridged version of the story. With some exceptions, this completely shatters most reason to play Calamity Trigger's story. It mostly focuses on Ragna's and Noelle's perspective, but those two are really the only ones that advance the plot anyways. You might be missing out on some lore and character details that help complement the story. I neglected to talk about it because I feared I mentioned it would completely shatter anyone's ability to care about me waffling about this game's story when a much easier version to consume it is in another game. I still advise playing CT's story for character interactions and world building, but given how complicated it would be, what's stopping someone who's strapped for time making the much easier method of playing Reconstruction and reading those details online? It's far from the only way to experience CT's story in a much easier manner, however. There's a massive pile of literature one can read. There's the CT light novels, 3 different CT manga adaptations, and the anime Alter Memory. Okay, maybe don't watch the anime. I don't bring all these examples and diminish CT's efforts, but to simply showcase that there are many different avenues of consuming the story, all of them with a far less complex way to do so. Even if some falter in quality, there is at least a demand for this kind of content that retells the story in different mediums. Which one you choose might be up to preference, but it rounds to my grand thesis statement about CT as a whole. Narratively, it serves as a poor introduction. The storyline is well written and compelling, but it's hard to grasp due to the strange nature and presentation. Without the adaptations of CS's Reconstruction mode, I fear that people would have been a lot more confused about the goings-on of CS's story without understanding CT's. But narrative isn't the only thing CT offers a mediocre introduction to. I've gone on quite a bit about CT's interesting mechanics and gameplay, but CS once again has several advantages over CT. Mainly, the game was balanced. Twice, in fact. CS was given much more time to properly balance and fine-tune its cast of characters, partially because it had a base to work off of, which allowed the development team to improve where they desperately needed to, as well as add new mechanics and new characters. Perhaps it's unfair to compare a game to its sequel, especially for the first game in the franchise, but this is ArcSys. This isn't a studio unfamiliar with the genre. They made Guilty Gear. It wasn't all the same people involved, but the questionable aspects of CT still present a hurdle of entry that can easily bar people from enjoying it, especially since the popular opinion is the games don't get good until CS Extend. I don't want to bully CT just for trying, but it can be hard to appreciate what it has started compared to its more talented and polished sister game. Is CT a bad place to start for gameplay mechanics? Well, a lot of fundamentals are fully functioning and still feel satisfying to use, but the lack of a networking ability or training mode curb a lot of players' potential to grow, 2 modes that CS has. Even if it's just word of mouth, people would still prefer to start a game with mechanics that can be applied to more popular titles in the franchise. ArcSys updated CS with free 2.0 update and a new version, while CT got a ports and a few smatterings of quality of life features, most of which aren't even in the PC version. I think the message is pretty clear. There are a ton of mechanics that got left in the dust once CT dropped, some of which I don't think I want to mention for the sake of brevity, and plenty more that were overhauled into a much less insane form. What do I think of CS's mechanics compared to CT's? You'll have to wait for the CS video. Whenever that is. I don't even know when I'll be finished this one. My life is kind of spiraled out of control, and God knows how long covering everything BBC Sex has to offer. Yeah, BBC Sex is what it's called. I'm hardly an expert on the topic, but it's saying something like the other games received expansions and future work, while CT was left in the dust, only remembered for its story, which has been adapted elsewhere countless times, and for its lackluster PC port. I know a fair bit of people come back to CT to experience some nostalgia and remember the dark ages, mostly new fans upset that she sucks in every other game. If you have to define CT as anything, let it be this: product of its time. It was cool for a late 2000s release and helped restore the genre to a much better place it is now as of recording. But CT is remembered as a foundational piece that paved the way, rather than a shining beacon on its own. It's a tough position to hold, but it's one that I respect it for. I really like this game not out of spite, but because of its flaws. Even the most frustrating parts of it still fail to be truly devastating and looping back to being charming. I don't think this game is that good of a starting point narratively or mechanically, but I don't think one can really appreciate where the franchise went past it and where it is now without paying respects to what lay the road ahead. And for that, I think we owe CT and the lovely people at ArcSys a huge thank you for their tremendous efforts. Even if you don't play this yourself, I hope my overview was a good enough starting point. That being said, I think it's high time to start wrapping things up. If you've made it this far, congratulations! Thanks for sticking up and putting up with me babbling for a couple hours, or however long this ends up being. I really don't know, man. Like, the audio is huge. I'm gonna have to cut like an hour from it of just me forgetting lines and my throat burning. Ugh. I suspect people have fallen asleep at this point and probably aren't paying attention to what I have to say and have long since clicked off, but if you're here, you're a real one. I appreciate you tuning in quite a bit. If you're into people rambling about video games for hours on end, then I think you know what to do. Go ahead and give me a like and subscribe and all that drivel. I can only really think of a couple really long videos about Blazblue and the style I'm doing. One is like a central fiction character overview that talks about everyone in pretty good detail, like more detail than I have. And I think the others are a big retrospective from Thorgy's Arcade, another channel. I think talking about the story of all 4 games and then talking about development and mechanics in the other one. I do think it's kind of funny that this video is going to be the same length when it's only talking about CT, longer than the entire story summary of the franchise. That isn't a diss from what I've seen, those videos are very well made, but it takes a special kind of work ethic to waste as much time as I did talking about a game no one's going to buy or play. Or even watch. I have no idea if this will do well, to be honest. I just kind of had to do it. I think I've spoken about everything I've wanted to, but there are a few miscellaneous details I could mention. There actually is another mode I neglected to talk about, score mode. Using your character of choice, you go against a ladder of people and try and get the like a high score, something like that? Who cares? I didn't cover it because I had nothing to say about it. It sucks. Listen, there is enough money in the world to get me talking about that balls. I have enough B-roll footage, thanks. I don't really want to script anything else from this point because I got everything I wanted to talk about, and I know I missed some details that will probably get me lynched by some, but that's okay. I'm very much a newcomer to this genre. I don't really know if people are going to start... I don't know how people are going to react, to be honest. I've only talked to some about it. I would really hope people just make fun of me for messing up turns and not get super irate about not talking about a hitbox or a really famous bug I've somehow missed or something. The script writing process has been so long, and it's basically caused my channel to die, which is not great, but here's hoping I can bring it back to life with something really obnoxiously long that gets people to click just on on the length and the runtime of it. You know, if like Pyrocynical can get easy views from talking about games no one cares about, I probably have a chance. I know damn well I have a friend of mine who is going to be on my ass about a few pedantic things. He's always going to be like, "What? Peter's not true! Nah, literally!" He's going to be in my ear with all that. If you got this far, you know who you are. And I apologize in advance for saying anything that might not be right about Soul. My bad, brother, but you know who you are. I don't expect this to go insanely big or even go viral because Blazblue is kind of irrelevant at the moment. And I don't think it's coming back anytime soon, but who knows? It's a very interesting franchise, and it's really tickled me pink in a lot of ways that nothing else has, so I just had to make something obnoxiously long. And if this turns out really well, then I'll probably get started on the later videos sooner, but I'm going to do regular stuff. This is not going to be new. This is exhausting. Everything about me is sore. My sleep schedule and my diet have completely crashed, and I want to fix that and have as healthy a lifestyle as a YouTuber can have. You know, not that healthy, but a little bit healthier. And I'm rambling again. Okay. Sorry for taking too much of your time, but if you got to this point, almost, 3 hours of me babbling about a game you probably haven't played, thanks for that. expect a regular upload a lot sooner than a month. Have a lovely rest of your day.